The parking garage beneath Brennan Technologies smelled like concrete and rain, and the particular desperation that comes from watching everything you've built turn to ash in your hands. Catherine Brennan sat in her Tesla Model S with the engine still running, staring at the security barrier that had refused to lift for her badge, the red LED mocking her with its mechanical certainty that she no longer belonged here. 11:47 on a Thursday night, the kind of hour when the city felt emptied out and waiting for something to happen, and what was happening was the systematic dismantling of her entire existence by people she'd trusted with everything except her capacity for survival. The knock on her window came from a man in a security uniform she recognized but couldn't name one of the dozen faceless contractors who cycled through the company's overnight shifts. He gestured for her to lower the window with the practiced authority of someone who'd delivered bad news to people above his pay grade before. Catherine complied, feeling the cold November air infiltrate the heated interior of her car, carrying with it the scent of distant industry and the particular emptiness of Chicago after midnight. "You're no longer authorized to enter the premises." The guard's voice carried neither sympathy nor satisfaction, just the flat efficiency of someone reading from a script he'd been given 5 minutes ago. "Ms. Brennan, there's been a board resolution. Effective immediately, you have been removed from all company positions and access has been revoked. I need you to surrender your badge and any company property in your possession." The words landed with the surreal quality of nightmare dialogue, the kind of thing that couldn't possibly be happening because it violated every fundamental understanding Catherine had built her professional life around. She'd founded Brennan Technologies 8 years ago, with two partners and a conviction that cybersecurity could be done better, faster, more ethically than the established players in the market. Grown it from 3 people in a co-working space to 400 employees across 6 offices. Weathered the startup valley of death and 3 separate attempts by larger competitors to acquire them. Built something that mattered not just financially but culturally, a company where people actually wanted to work because they believed in the mission beyond the paycheck. "I'm the CEO." Catherine heard her own voice as if from a great distance, the automatic response of someone whose identity had become so intertwined with her position that separation seemed anatomically impossible. "I built this company. There must be some mistake. Who authorized this? Where's the documentation?" The guard pulled a tablet from his belt, angled it toward her window with the careful precision of someone who'd been told to expect denial and argument. The screen showed a board resolution dated that afternoon, signed by 6 of the 7 board members, removing Catherine Brennan from the position of Chief Executive Officer and all associated roles effective at close of business. The signatures were authentic, the corporate seal looked genuine, and the legal language had the clinical precision that came from lawyers who'd done this before and knew exactly how to make termination look procedural rather than personal. Catherine's hands tightened on the steering wheel, leather creaking beneath her grip. Richard Holloway's signature sat at the top of the list, the flowing script she'd seen on 1,000 documents over 8 years of partnership. Her mentor, the man who'd convinced the original founding team to bring her on as CEO when she was barely 30, who'd taught her how to navigate board politics and investor relations, and the 1,000 small compromises that came with growing a company past the point where idealism could sustain it. Below his signature sat Patricia Voss, the former Air Force colonel who joined the board 3 years ago and brought with her the kind of operational discipline that had transformed their project management. Then David Martinez, the venture capitalist who'd led their Series B and sat through 100 strategy sessions where Catherine had defended her vision against pressure to prioritize growth over sustainability. Every signature was a small betrayal, each one representing someone she'd worked beside and trusted and believed understood what they were building together. Catherine felt something crack inside her chest, not the dramatic shattering that movies promised, but something quieter and more devastating, the slow recognition that the foundation she'd been standing on had never been as solid as she'd convinced herself it was. "I need to speak with Richard." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "There's been a misunderstanding. I have documents in my office that will clarify whatever concerns the board has raised. If you'll just let me access the building for 15 minutes. The guard's expression shifted into something that might have been pity if he'd allowed himself that luxury in a job that required emotional distance. "Ma'am, I have explicit instructions. You're not permitted to enter under any circumstances. If you attempt to force entry, I'm authorized to call Chicago PD and have you removed for trespassing." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I'm sorry, but my supervisor was very clear. This isn't a negotiation." Catherine looked past him toward the building's glass entrance, the lobby visible through floor-to-ceiling windows that had cost a fortune during the renovation 2 years ago. Movement caught her eye, figures gathering in the reception area, and with growing horror she recognized the setup. Television crews, news cameras, her board members arranged in a semicircle, like they were posing for a corporate photograph, champagne glasses in hand, celebrating something that required documentation. Richard Holloway stood at the center, tall and distinguished in the way that came from old money and Yale Business School, his silver hair perfectly styled, even at midnight, his smile carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who'd planned this moment down to the lighting. He raised his glass toward the window, toward Catherine sitting in her car in the parking garage, a toast that doubled as acknowledgement and dismissal. The gesture was so casually cruel that Catherine felt her breath catch the recognition that this wasn't business strategy or corporate maneuvering, but something personal, something vindictive, something she'd somehow earned without understanding how or when she'd crossed whatever line had transformed mentor into enemy. Catherine's badge clattered on the concrete as she fumbled with her seatbelt, some part of her brain still convinced that if she could just reach Richard, just explain whatever misunderstanding had catalyzed this nightmare, everything could be unwound back to normalcy. She pushed her car door open with enough force that it banged against the concrete pillar, stumbled out into the garage with her designer heels clicking on painted lines that marked where employees were supposed to park in the orderly world where rules mattered and positions meant something. The guard moved to intercept her, one hand on his radio, but Catherine was already running toward the elevator bank, her body operating on autopilot, while her mind struggled to process the betrayal unfolding in real time. The elevator doors stood open like an invitation, and she lunged for them before common sense could override panic, jabbing at the button for the ground floor lobby where Richard waited with cameras and champagne and whatever narrative he'd prepared to explain why Catherine Brennan no longer belonged in the company she'd built. The elevator rose with agonizing slowness, floor indicators lighting in sequence, giving Catherine 30 seconds to recognize what she was walking into and powerless to change course. The doors opened directly into the lobby, the grand entrance she'd designed to project success and innovation, and the kind of corporate culture where transparency wasn't just marketing copy. Instead, she walked into an execution, every detail choreographed for maximum humiliation. The cameras turned toward her in synchronized motion, red recording lights, like predatory eyes. Richard's smile widened as he registered her presence, and Catherine understood too late that this was exactly what he'd wanted, the dramatic confrontation that would play on tomorrow's business news. His voice carried across the lobby with practiced projection, the tone of someone who'd rehearsed his lines. "Catherine, I'm glad you could join us for the announcement. The board has voted to restructure leadership in light of certain financial irregularities that have come to our attention. We believe this is the best path forward for the company's future." Financial irregularities. The words hung in the air like accusation wrapped in corporate euphemism. Catherine felt the lobby tilt, her vision narrowing to Richard's face, trying to find some trace of the man who'd mentored her, who'd believed in her, who'd defended her against board members, who'd questioned whether someone so young could handle the CEO position. Instead, she saw only cold calculation, the look of someone who'd made a decision and committed to it completely. "What irregularities?" Catherine's voice came out hoarse, the question automatic, even though some part of her already knew the answer wouldn't matter. "I've done nothing wrong. The financials are clean. Every transaction is documented and approved through proper channels. If there's been an error, we can review it together and correct it immediately." Patricia Voss stepped forward, military posture radiating authority and disappointment in equal measure. "Ms. Brennan, the board has reviewed evidence of systematic fund transfers totaling approximately $60 million over the past 18 months. Transfers that bear your digital signature and authorization codes. Funds that have disappeared into a network of shell companies we're still working to untangle." She paused, letting the numbers sink in before delivering the final blow. "We've already notified the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. They'll want to speak with you soon. $60 million. The number was so absurd that Catherine almost laughed hysterical recognition. that this wasn't real, couldn't be real, existed in some parallel universe where she was the kind of person who embezzled company funds and lived a secret life of corporate crime. She'd never even exceeded her corporate credit card limit, had turned down salary increases during the lean years to ensure they could keep hiring, and engineers, had built her entire professional identity around integrity. That sometimes felt like handicapping herself against competitors who didn't share her scruples. That's impossible. Catherine heard the desperation in her own voice and hated it. Hated that she was defending herself against charges so ludicrous they shouldn't require defense. I haven't authorized any unusual transfers. My signature protocols are secure. Someone must have accessed my accounts without authorization, which means this is a security breach. We need to investigate immediately rather than security has already locked you out of all systems. David Martinez spoke with the uncomfortable precision of someone who'd calculated the optimal way to deliver information designed to destroy. Your credentials were revoked at 6 p.m. this evening after the irregularities were discovered during routine audit. We've preserved all digital evidence for the federal investigation. His expression suggested he found the whole situation regrettable, but necessary, a business decision divorced from personal relationship. Catherine took a step backward, her heel catching on the marble floor she'd personally selected during renovation, nearly falling before she caught herself on the reception desk. The physical stumble matched the psychological vertigo of watching her entire world reconstruct itself around a narrative she didn't recognize, where she was the villain rather than the protagonist. The cameras captured everything, and she imagined how this would look tomorrow morning on CNBC and Bloomberg, and every tech blog that had covered Brennan Technologies' rise, disgraced CEO confronted by her own board evidence of embezzlement, the familiar story of founder hubris and eventual collapse. I need a lawyer. The words came out steadier than Catherine felt survival instinct finally overriding shock. I'm not discussing this further without legal representation, and I want to see the evidence you claim supports these accusations. Until then, I'm invoking my rights as a shareholder and board member to access company records relevant to you're no longer a board member. Richard's interruption was surgical, cutting through her protest with the precision of someone who'd anticipated every argument. The board voted unanimously to remove you from all positions, including your board seat, based on the evidence of financial malfeasance. Your shareholding remains intact for now, but we're exploring options for forced redemption based on breach of fiduciary duty. He set down his champagne glass on the reception desk, the crystal clinking with finality. You should leave now, Catherine. Security will escort you from the premises if necessary. The lobby doors stood behind her, glass panels that had seemed elegant when she'd commissioned them, but now felt like transparent cage walls. Catherine turned toward them, desperate to escape the cameras, and the betrayal and the champagne toast celebrating her destruction, but her badge no longer worked, and the magnetic lock stayed engaged. She pulled at the door handle with increasing desperation, the metal cold beneath her fingers locked out of her own company with executive efficiency. A hand caught her elbow as she stumbled backward, steadying her with gentle firmness that contrasted sharply with the hostile energy radiating from her former board. Catherine spun around, expecting security to drag her away, instead finding a man in a janitor's uniform who'd appeared from nowhere with the supernatural timing of someone who'd been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. He was older than the usual overnight maintenance staff, maybe early 40s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke to experience beyond pushing a mop around corporate lobbies. His eyes held something that made Catherine pause mid-panic, an intelligence and sadness that didn't match the custodian uniform. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that the cameras wouldn't pick it up, meant only for her. Careful. Tonight, everything you believed has been orchestrated, and I have something that will shatter it all. Catherine stared at him, trying to process this new variable in an equation that had already stopped making sense. The janitor's grip on her elbow was firm, but not restrictive, guiding her away from the doors and toward a corridor marked for maintenance access only. Richard's voice rose behind them, calling for security to remove the trespasser, but the janitor moved with confidence that suggested he knew exactly where cameras were and wasn't concerned about being recorded. Who are you? Catherine's question came out as barely more than whisper, following him down the corridor, because the alternative was staying in that lobby with cameras and accusations and the wreckage of everything she'd built. Why are you helping me? The janitor didn't answer immediately, just kept walking until they reached a storage room marked with hazard warnings about cleaning chemicals. He produced a key from his belt, unlocked the door with practiced ease, gestured for Catherine to enter. The room was cramped and smelled like industrial soap and old promises that had curdled into something toxic. He closed the door behind them, cutting off the sounds from the lobby, creating a pocket of relative safety in a building that had turned hostile. "My name is Daniel Crawford." The janitor pulled off his work gloves, revealing hands that didn't match his occupation, too clean and uncalloused for someone who supposedly spent nights scrubbing floors. 5 years ago, I was director of security infrastructure for this company. I designed every access protocol, every encryption standard, every defensive system you have been running since day one. His expression darkened with memory. Until Richard Holloway destroyed my career and got my wife killed to cover up a crime that makes your situation look like petty theft. Catherine's mind raced through company history, trying to place the name Daniel Crawford in the organizational charts from before her time as CEO. She'd inherited most of the technical infrastructure, never questioned the foundations, because they worked and worked well. But she'd seen references to security overhauls around the time of the warehouse fire, the tragedy that had killed nearly 24 workers and resulted in millions in settlements, and the kind of bad publicity that Richard had somehow managed to contain and move past. The warehouse fire. Catherine's voice was barely audible, connecting pieces she'd never examined closely because the incident predated her involvement in leadership. "Your wife died in that fire." Daniel nodded once, sharp and economical, the gesture of someone who had learned to compress grief into manageable packets. Jennifer Crawford, Human Resources Manager. She was doing late inventory in a facility that Richard had deliberately stripped of safety systems to save money. Fire suppression offline exit doors, chained shut to prevent theft inspection, records falsified to avoid regulatory fines. 23 people burned to death for the crime of working overtime. His hands clenched into fists before he forced them to relax. The company covered it up, blamed equipment, failure, paid settlements with non-disclosure agreements. And when I tried to expose the truth, Richard framed me for negligence, threatened criminal charges, unless I signed an NDA, and disappeared. Catherine felt sick, the kind of nausea that came from recognizing that the ground beneath your feet was quicksand and had been all along. She'd known about the fire in abstract terms, the way you know about historical events that happened before you arrived, tragic but processed and moved past. She'd never questioned the official narrative because Richard had presented it as a painful lesson learned. Reforms implemented, the kind of corporate crisis that tested character but ultimately strengthened the organization. Instead, it had been murder, followed by cover-up, followed by the destruction of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. "Why are you telling me this?" Catherine looked at Daniel with growing understanding that this wasn't random, that his presence in this storage room at this exact moment represented planning and patience and a debt he was calling in. "Why help me at all when you have every reason to want this company destroyed?" Daniel reached into his custodian cart, pulled out a small silver USB drive that looked innocuous except for the weight of whatever information it contained. "Because Michael Garrett asked me to." Michael, who was CFO when you took over as CEO, who supposedly died of a heart attack 6 weeks ago. Michael, who was my best friend and the only person who fought for the truth after Jennifer died. He pressed the USB into Catherine's hand, the metal still warm from being close to his body. Michael spent the last 3 years collecting evidence against Richard, documenting every crime and cover-up and betrayal. "He gave me this as insurance, told me if anything happened to him to find you. Said you were the only person who didn't know what Richard was really building here." Catherine closed her fingers around the USB, feeling the physical weight of evidence that could either vindicate her or implicate her further in crimes she hadn't known existed. Michael Garrett had been a quiet presence during her tenure as CEO, competent and thorough, but never particularly warm, someone she'd relied on for financial oversight without developing personal connection beyond professional respect. His death had been sudden but not suspicious, the kind of thing that happened to men in their 60s who worked too many hours and didn't exercise enough and carried stress in their bodies until something vital gave out. "You think Richard killed him?" Catherine made it a statement rather than question, following the logic to its inevitable conclusion. "You think Michael discovered something that made him too dangerous to keep alive, and Richard orchestrated his death to look like natural causes?" "I know he did." Daniel's certainty was absolute, the conviction of someone who'd spent years mapping patterns of corruption and recognized the signature when he saw it. Michael contacted me 3 months ago, said he had everything we needed to bring down Richard and the board members who'd been complicit in the cover-ups. He was planning to go public work with federal investigators, expose the entire network of crimes that stretched back decades. His voice cracked slightly before he controlled it. 1 week later, he's dead of a heart attack, alone in his office after everyone else had gone home. Autopsies showed nothing suspicious because Richard has medical examiners on his payroll, the same way he has fire marshals and building inspectors. The storage room felt smaller than it had moments ago, the walls pressing in with the weight of conspiracy that was either real or the most elaborate paranoid fantasy Catherine had ever encountered. She wanted to dismiss Daniel's claims as the delusions of someone who'd never recovered from trauma, whose grief had curdled into seeing patterns where only randomness existed. But the USB in her hand was real, and so was the systematic dismantling of her career that had happened with surgical precision, and so was the fact that Richard had orchestrated her humiliation for cameras with the casual cruelty of someone who'd done this before. "What's on the drive?" Catherine looked down at the innocent-seeming device that supposedly contained enough evidence to either save her or confirm that she'd walked into something far more dangerous than simple corporate politics. "How do I know this isn't another layer of the frame-up evidence that will make me look guilty when I try to use it?" Daniel's expression softened slightly, recognition of legitimate paranoia that matched his own. "Because Michael was my friend, and I watched him die, defending people he barely knew, because it was the right thing to do. Because I spent 5 years learning to be invisible in this company, mopping floors and emptying trash and listening to conversations people don't bother hiding from janitors. Because I've mapped every crime Richard has committed, every person he's destroyed, every life he's ruined in pursuit of profit and power." His voice dropped to something barely above whisper. "And because when I saw you tonight, stumbling in that lobby with cameras recording your humiliation, you had the same look in your eyes my wife had the night before she died. Confused, betrayed, convinced that if you just understood what was happening, you could fix it. I couldn't save Jennifer. Maybe I can save you." The words landed with the weight of confession and commitment, the kind of statement that couldn't be taken back once spoken. Catherine studied Daniel's face, looking for deception or manipulation or the signs of elaborate trap-finding. Instead, only exhaustion and determination, and the hollow-eyed appearance of someone who'd been carrying grief so long it had become part of his skeletal structure. "I don't even know if I can trust you." Catherine spoke the truth plainly, recognizing that paranoia was appropriate response to having her entire reality reconstructed in the span of an hour. "For all I know, you're part of whatever Richard is doing, another piece designed to push me towards some action that will justify whatever charges he's planning to file. Then don't trust me." Daniel pulled out a battered laptop from beneath a shelf of cleaning supplies, flipped it open with practiced efficiency. "Trust the evidence. Trust Michael's voice. Trust your own eyes when you see what they've been doing." He plugged in the USB drive, fingers moving across the keyboard with speed that didn't match his janitor role typing passwords and bypassing security with the casual confidence of someone who'd built these systems and knew every backdoor. The screen filled with folders, hundreds of them, organized with meticulous precision. Financial records, security logs, audio recordings, video files. Everything you'd need to prove that the $60 million wasn't embezzled by you. It was stolen by Richard through a network of shell companies he's been running for years. Catherine leaned closer, scanning file names that suggested documentation far more comprehensive than anything she'd maintained as CEO. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the laptop, opening folders at random, seeing her own name attached to financial transactions. She'd never authorized transfers that bore her digital signature, but originated from IP addresses she'd never accessed. The timestamp showed a pattern, always when she was traveling, always during windows when she had documented alibis that could prove she wasn't anywhere near company systems. "He's been building this for months." Catherine's voice was hollow with recognition of how completely she'd been manipulated, how every business trip and board meeting and operational decision had been cataloged and used to construct an alternate timeline where she was criminal mastermind rather than oblivious target. "Every transaction matches times when I was out of the office, usually out of the state entirely. I have calendar entries, flight records, hotel confirmations that prove I was nowhere near Chicago when these transfers supposedly happened. which is why the evidence won't hold up under serious investigation. Daniel navigated to another folder, this one containing security logs that showed remote access to Catherine's accounts from Richard's office computer. But Richard's not planning for serious investigation. He's planning for public conviction media trial, the kind of damage to your reputation that makes actual legal proceedings almost beside the point. By the time investigators untangle the real story, you'll be unemployable, possibly facing criminal charges, definitely destroyed as far as the tech industry is concerned. He pulled up another file email exchanges between Richard and board members. They debated whether to have you arrested tonight or just destroy you financially. Patricia Voss pushed for criminal charges, but David Martinez thought it was cleaner to let social media do the work. Catherine read the emails with growing horror, watching her character assassination planned with the casual efficiency of people discussing quarterly projections. The messages referenced her age, her gender, her relative inexperience, compared to Richard's decades in the industry, questioning whether she'd ever really been qualified for the CEO position or if her appointment had been diversity theater that had predictably failed. The casual cruelty was breathtaking, the way they discussed her destruction, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a human being whose life they were deliberately ruining. Why now? Catherine looked up from the screen, needing to understand the timing, even if the methodology made sense. I've been CEO for 8 years. If Richard wanted me gone, wanted to position himself as the company's savior, why wait until now? Daniel opened a final folder, this one containing financial projections and acquisition offers from major tech companies. Because you succeeded. You built Brennan Technologies into something valuable enough that Richard can sell it for real money, but only if you're not around to object. He gestured to the screen where offer letters showed valuations approaching $2 billion, contingent on clean leadership transition and resolution of any outstanding governance issues. He's been negotiating this deal for 6 months, probably since before Michael started collecting evidence. He needs you gone, needs the company's reputation temporarily damaged, so he can swoop in as the hero who saves it and sells it to the highest bidder. The board members who signed off on your removal tonight, they all have golden parachutes built into the acquisition terms, severance packages that make them rich for betraying everything you built together. The scale of the betrayal was almost too large to process the recognition that this wasn't impulsive decision or business disagreement, but systematic planning that stretched back months or possibly years. Richard had recruited board members, orchestrated financial crimes, murdered people who threatened his plans, all while maintaining the persona of trusted mentor who'd believed in Catherine's potential. She'd sat through hundreds of meetings with him, trusted his counsel on strategic decisions, defended him to employees who'd occasionally raise concerns about his old school management style. Every interaction had been performance, every mentoring session, a manipulation, every expression of confidence in her leadership, a calculated investment in the puppet he'd installed. The laptop was still displaying acquisition offers when Catherine's phone buzzed in her pocket, the vibration jarring her back to present circumstances. The screen showed a text message from an unknown number, no words but a link to a live stream. Against better judgment, she clicked through, watching with sick fascination as the feed loaded to show the lobby she'd fled minutes ago. Richard was giving a press conference explaining with practiced sorrow about the difficult decision to remove a trusted colleague who'd betrayed that trust, financial irregularities that required immediate action, the board's commitment to transparency and proper governance. News anchors were already picking up the story, Catherine's photo appearing beside headlines about embezzlement and corporate corruption and founder failure. They're destroying you in real time. Daniel's voice was gentle but unflinching, forcing Catherine to witness the assassination she couldn't prevent. Tomorrow morning, you'll be the lead story on every business news site, the cautionary tale about young CEOs who can't handle the pressure and turn to crime. Legal proceedings will take months or years, plenty of time for Richard to complete the acquisition and cash out, by which point nobody will care about your innocence because the narrative has already been written. Catherine closed her phone, unable to watch her public execution continue. The storage room suddenly felt like a cell, cramped and airless, and offering no escape from the trap closing around her. She'd built her entire adult identity around competence and integrity and the conviction that hard work and ethical behavior would be recognized and rewarded. Instead, she'd been naive, blind to the predators who saw her principles as exploitable weakness rather than admirable strength. So what do I do? The question came out smaller than Catherine intended, the voice of someone whose strategic planning had failed to account for systematic betrayal by everyone she trusted. I can't go home. They probably have surveillance waiting to document whatever evidence they planted there. I can't access company systems to defend myself. My credentials are revoked. I can't even hire a lawyer without money, and I'm guessing my bank accounts are frozen pending investigation. Her voice cracked slightly. I'm completely alone, and they've made sure I have no resources to fight back. You're not alone. Daniel spoke with quiet conviction that carried more weight than louder proclamations would have. Michael left you more than just evidence on this drive. He left you an ally who knows every system in this company, who's been invisible for 5 years, learning how Richard operates, who has nothing left to lose, and every reason to see justice done. His expression hardened into something that might have been anticipation. And you're not without resources. You're just cut off from the ones they could control. Tomorrow morning we go back to headquarters. Public visible, documented. We let them see you've returned to fight, let them panic about what you might know and who you might have contacted. Then while they're scrambling to manage the narrative, we get to the real evidence Michael collected. Catherine tried to imagine walking back into that building, facing the employees who by morning would believe she was criminal, dealing with security and media and the hostile environment that had been her company 24 hours ago. The prospect felt impossible exposure without protection, but the alternative was hiding while Richard completed her destruction unopposed. Where's the real evidence? She looked at the USB drive that supposedly contained comprehensive documentation of crimes spanning years. If this is just a copy, where's the original that can't be dismissed as fabricated or altered? Data Vault Level B3. Daniel's answer came with the confidence of someone who'd planned this conversation long before tonight. The old server farm that got deprecated when you upgraded infrastructure 3 years ago. Michael never deleted his files from those systems, just moved them to a hidden partition nobody knew existed except him and me. Physical evidence on hardware that hasn't been touched in years. Timestamps and metadata that prove everything was collected in real time rather than fabricated afterward. He met her eyes with intensity that demanded engagement. But we can't access it remotely. Richard's already watching for any attempts to breach company systems from outside. We have to go back inside, get to the physical servers, extract everything before Richard realizes what Michael left behind. The plan was insane, walking back into a building where she was now trespasser rather than CEO, attempting to access secure areas that would be monitored and defended by people who believed she was criminal, deserving prosecution. But Catherine recognized that insanity was relative when the alternative was accepting destruction without fighting back. Why are you really doing this? Catherine studied Daniel's face, looking past the convenient narrative of friendship and honor and seeing something darker underneath a particular obsession that came from years of nursing grievance. Michael's gone, your wife is gone. Richard has already taken everything from you. Why risk whatever life you've built for yourself to help someone you barely know? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the laptop keyboard, fingers resting on keys like he was preparing to type confession. He'd never allowed himself to speak. Because Jennifer died believing I'd save her, that I'd make sure her death mattered, that I wouldn't let the people who killed her get away with murder. Because I spent 5 years being invisible, telling myself I was protecting my dignity by refusing to engage when really I was just a coward who let fear paralyze him. His voice dropped to barely audible. Because I have a daughter 9 years old who's growing up in a world where powerful people can kill with impunity if they're rich enough and connected enough. Because Michael died trying to stop this, and I owe him more than watching his murder go unavenged. And because when I saw you stumbling in that lobby tonight, I saw another person about to be destroyed by Richard's machine, and I was tired of collecting bodies without fighting back. The confession landed between them with the weight of truth too raw to be strategic manipulation. Catherine recognized in Daniel the particular kind of damage that came from surviving trauma, while everyone around you died, the guilt that transformed into mission, because purpose was the only antidote to drowning in what-ifs and if-onlys. He was using her cause for his own catharsis, but that didn't make their interests misalign, just made the arrangement honest about mutual exploitation in service of revenge disguised as justice. Tomorrow morning, then, Catherine straightened her spine, feeling the physical manifestation of decision that couldn't be undone. We go back to headquarters, visible and documented, force them to react rather than execute their plan on comfortable timeline. If I'm going down, I'm taking Richard with me and everyone who stood beside him while he destroyed people for profit. Daniel nodded once satisfied, then began showing Catherine the building schematics he'd memorized over 5 years of invisible observation, mapping routes, and access points, and security gaps that existed because he'd designed the original systems. They talked through contingencies and backup plans, and the thousand details that separated preparation from improvisation. Outside the storage room, the building hummed with overnight activity cleaning crews and skeleton IT staff, and the security contractors who'd locked Catherine out of her own company. Somewhere in Chicago, Richard Holloway was probably celebrating with his co-conspirators, toasting their successful execution of a plan, years in the making, confident that by morning Catherine Brennan would be yesterday's news cautionary tale rather than competitor. He'd underestimated her capacity for survival, her willingness to burn everything down rather than accept destruction quietly. More critically, he'd forgotten about Daniel Crawford, entirely dismissed him as collateral damage from a crime 5 years past, failed to recognize that invisible people have the best view of everything you don't want seen. The night stretched ahead with the particular tension of calm before inevitable storm. Catherine and Daniel sat in that cramped storage room, planning their assault on the company she'd built, and he'd been exiled from two people with nothing left to lose, except the small hope that truth might matter more than power, that justice might occasionally triumph over expedience, that sometimes the people who seemed weakest turned out to be strongest, precisely because they'd already survived the worst that could happen to them. The city outside continued its indifferent existence, millions of people sleeping through the small crisis that would dominate tomorrow's news cycle before being forgotten next week, when some other company imploded and some other executive fell from grace. Catherine thought about her apartment, the life she'd built around work, that consumed most waking hours, the relationships she'd let atrophy because building a company felt more important than maintaining friendships. Richard had stripped away her professional identity with such efficiency that it forced reckoning with how little else existed underneath how completely she defined herself by position rather than character. "You should try to sleep," Daniel's voice interrupted her spiral into existential crisis. "Tomorrow will be brutal, and you need to be sharp enough to navigate whatever ambush Richard has prepared. I'll stay here, make sure nobody finds you before morning." The offer was practical and impossible to accept the idea of sleeping while the world reconstructed itself around accusations and betrayal. But Catherine recognized that exhaustion would make her vulnerable, that she needed whatever rest could be stolen from hours that felt endless and punishing. She curled into an uncomfortable position against shelving units that smelled like industrial cleaner, closed her eyes without expecting sleep, found herself drifting into something adjacent to rest, while Daniel kept watch with the patient vigilance of someone accustomed to overnight shifts. Dreams came fragmented and anxious replays of Richard's mocking toast mixed with the warehouse fire. Daniel had described her own face superimposed on footage of people trapped behind chained doors while flames consumed everything combustible. She woke repeatedly to find Daniel still awake, still watching, still present in ways that felt both comforting and unsettling. By 5:30, the exhaustion had accumulated into something manageable, the kind of wired alertness that would sustain her through crisis before collapsing into aftermath. Morning arrived with the particular quality of Chicago in November pale light that promised cold without delivering actual warmth. Daniel helped Catherine to her feet, the stiffness from sleeping against shelving, making her feel decades older than 38. They moved through the building's back corridors, avoiding early arrivals and security cameras, emerging into the parking garage, where Catherine's Tesla still sat like a abandoned monument to her former life. Drive separately. Daniel gave her his phone number instructions for where to meet before approaching the building. 7:30, right when morning shift arrives and media crews are setting up. "We want maximum visibility, maximum documentation of your arrival. Richard will have planned for you to hide or lawyer up immediately. When you show up ready to fight, he'll panic, and panicked people make mistakes." Catherine nodded, climbing into her car with the surreal sensation of inhabiting a life that no longer fit properly. The drive home took her through neighborhoods just waking up past coffee shops and bus stops, and the ordinary machinery of people starting ordinary days, unaware that the woman in the Tesla crawling through traffic had been systematically destroyed overnight and was planning counterattack that might burn down everything it touched. Her apartment looked exactly as she'd left it yesterday morning, back when she'd still been CEO of a successful company, back when her biggest concerns were quarterly projections and hiring freezes, and the normal anxieties of someone building something ambitious. The space felt foreign now, staged rather than lived in the furniture and artwork and carefully curated aesthetic that projected success without suggesting much about the person who'd selected it. Catherine showered and changed clothes, selecting business casual that split the difference between defiant and defeated armor that wouldn't look like she was trying too hard to project confidence she didn't feel. Her phone had exploded with notifications overnight, hundreds of messages from colleagues and investors and journalists and former employees, everyone wanting comment or expressing sympathy or asking if the allegations were true. Catherine ignored all of it, the noise of a feeding frenzy she couldn't navigate without getting torn apart by the crowd. One message stood out from her college roommate who'd stayed in her life despite Catherine's workaholic neglect. Just saw the news. Don't know if allegations are true, and don't care. Whatever you need, I'm here. Call me when you can breathe again. The simple statement of loyalty without judgment made Catherine's eyes burn with tears she wouldn't permit herself to shed. Later if she survived, whatever was about to happen, she'd call Madison and attempt to explain how completely her life had imploded. For now, she filed the message as evidence that someone existed who remembered her as person rather than position anchor point when everything else was drifting. The drive to headquarters took her through downtown Chicago traffic that felt both familiar and alien. The commute she'd made thousands of times now, carrying entirely different meaning. Catherine found herself cataloging details she'd never noticed before. For the specific texture of morning light, through buildings, the faces of other drivers, trapped in their private universes of concern, the fragile normality that existed only because most people never experienced the kind of destruction she was navigating. Daniel was waiting in the coffee shop across from Brennan Technologies, sitting by the window with untouched coffee and the carefully neutral expression of someone watching for trouble. He'd changed from his janitor uniform into clothes that looked deliberately generic, the kind of outfit that helped you blend into crowds without attracting notice. When he saw Catherine approaching, he stood not moving toward her, but ready to intercept if she needed support. They assembled. The observation was economical statement of fact that carried no judgment. Media crews building security, probably police waiting inside in case you tried to force entry to areas you are no longer authorized to access. Richard standing by the lobby entrance like he's holding court, playing the role of responsible executive, forced to deal with betrayal. Catherine could see through the coffee shop window what Daniel described, the theatrical staging of her return transformed into public spectacle. News vans with satellite equipment, reporters checking hair and makeup cameras positioned for optimal angles on confrontation that Richard had clearly promised would happen. He stood inside the glass doors, surrounded by people Catherine recognized from the board and senior management, everyone positioned to witness her humiliation when she arrived. The walk across the street felt like traversing battlefield, under fire, every step documented by cameras that would replay this moment in endless loops, depending on how the story resolved. Catherine kept her spine straight and her expression neutral, refusing to give them the image of defeated executive slinking back to scene of supposed crimes. Daniel walked slightly behind and to her left, close enough to matter, but not so close that he appeared to be providing protection she needed. The crowd parted as she approached the entrance employees who'd arrived for morning shift, creating corridor of hostile curiosity and camera phones. Catherine heard the murmurs, saw the expressions that ranged from schadenfreude to disappointment to anger at betrayal they believed she'd committed. These were people she'd hired, whose careers she'd supported, who'd celebrated with her when the company hit milestones and commiserated during setbacks. Now they were audience to her destruction, convinced by overnight news cycle that she was criminal deserving public shaming. Richard's smile widened as Catherine reached the glass doors, his expression projecting sorrow and determination, and the particular satisfaction of someone who'd planned this moment meticulously. He made no move to unlock the doors, forcing Catherine to stand outside like supplicant, requesting entry rather than founder demanding access to her own company. Catherine. His voice carried through the glass with artificial warmth that made her skin crawl. I didn't expect you to show your face here this morning. Most people in your situation would be speaking with lawyers, not confronting the colleagues they betrayed. He gestured to the gathered employees and media. But since you're here, perhaps you'd like to explain to everyone how $60 million disappeared under your leadership, or apologize to the hundreds of employees whose retirement funds you put at risk through your financial mismanagement. The accusations were designed for maximum media impact. Sound bites that would play well on evening news and social media, cementing the narrative of Catherine as failed leader who'd succumbed to temptation. She felt the weight of cameras focused on her reaction, the crowd waiting to see if she'd break down or fight back or confirm their worst assumptions through silence that suggested guilt. I'm here because I'm innocent. Catherine's voice came out steadier than she felt, projecting across the space with clarity that surprised her. I'm here because the allegations against me are fabricated, and I can prove it. I'm here because someone orchestrated this coup using financial crimes they committed themselves, then blamed me to cover their tracks. She shifted her gaze directly to Richard, holding eye contact with the man who'd mentored her into position he could later destroy. I know what you did, Richard. I know about the warehouse fire, about Michael's murder, about the network of crimes you've been covering up for years. And by the end of today, everyone else will know too. The crowd's murmur shifted, confusion replacing certainty, Catherine's direct accusation forcing them to reconsider the narrative they'd accepted overnight. Richard's expression flickered for a fraction of a second, surprise that she'd gone on offense rather than defense, calculation about how to regain control of situation that was slipping away from his carefully scripted staging. Those are serious allegations, Catherine, and completely without foundation. Richard recovered quickly, tone shifting to patient condescension, usually reserved for explaining obvious things to children. I understand you're upset about the board's decision, but making wild accusations won't change the evidence we've documented. The financial transfers bear your digital signature, originated from your accounts, occurred during times when you had exclusive access to company systems. His gesture took in the assembled crowd. Everyone here knows you've been under tremendous stress, working impossible hours, possibly suffering from exhaustion that impaired your judgment. We're prepared to be compassionate if you acknowledge your mistakes and work with investigators to recover the missing funds. The offer was trap disguised as mercy, designed to look reasonable while creating video footage of Catherine's refusal that could be spun as evidence of guilty conscience. She recognized the manipulation, immediately saw how Richard was playing to audience rather than actually engaging with her accusations. The man was pathologically unable to have honest conversation when performance served his interest better. I'm not asking for compassion. I'm demanding access to company systems so I can prove my innocence. Catherine stepped closer to the glass doors, forcing Richard to either engage or reveal that his reasonable executive persona was costume. I have alibis for every transaction you claim I authorized, documented proof I was out of state or out of the country during windows when my accounts were supposedly used. But I can't access the security logs that would prove remote access without my physical presence, can't review the metadata that would show IP addresses originating from devices I've never used. She paused, letting the logic settle. Unless you're afraid of what that investigation would reveal about who actually has access to my credentials and the ability to forge my digital signature. The accusation landed cleanly, forcing Richard into position where refusing her access would look suspicious, while granting it would risk exposing the mechanisms of his frame-up. Patricia Voss stepped forward, military-bearing, projecting authority that tried to override Catherine's challenge. Ms. Brennan, the board has already approved independent forensic audit of all financial systems. Your credentials have been revoked pending completion of that audit and resolution of criminal investigation. Granting you access would compromise evidence integrity and potentially allow you to alter records in your favor. She gestured toward unmarked cars visible at the curb. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division has agents waiting to interview you. I suggest you cooperate with their investigation rather than making baseless accusations against colleagues who've spent decades building this company's reputation. The mention of FBI was designed to intimidate, remind Catherine that this had escalated beyond corporate politics into potential criminal prosecution. But Catherine had spent the night reviewing Michael's files, seeing documented evidence of crimes that made her supposed embezzlement look like parking ticket in comparison. The revelation that federal investigators were already involved suggested Richard had moved faster than she'd anticipated, leveraging law enforcement to legitimize his narrative before she could mount effective defense. I'm happy to cooperate with any legitimate investigation. Catherine spoke directly to the cameras, aware this moment would define public perception regardless of eventual truth. I welcome forensic audit of company finances because it will prove the transactions attributed to me originated from sources I didn't control. What I won't accept is being locked out of my own company while Richard Holloway destroys evidence of his crimes and positions himself as hero who saved Brennan Technologies from my supposed incompetence. The glass doors remain locked, Richard making no move to grant access, the standoff playing out for cameras that documented every facial expression and tone of voice. Catherine recognized she'd miscalculated, slightly underestimating Richard's willingness to weather public confrontation, rather than risk giving her even temporary access to systems that might contain evidence he hadn't fully scrubbed. The plan Daniel had outlined assumed Richard would panic and make mistakes, but instead he was calmly maintaining siege posture that kept Catherine external and powerless. Then I'll see you in court with the evidence I've collected that proves your guilt. Catherine delivered the line with more confidence than she felt the bluff of someone holding weaker cards than she pretended. Federal investigators might be interested to learn about financial irregularities dating back years before I joined this company, about warehouse fires and safety violations and death covered up through falsified inspection records, about CFOs who died suspiciously convenient to timelines when they were preparing to expose corporate fraud. Richard's mask slipped fractionally, anger flashing across features before control reasserted itself. The reaction was subtle enough that most observers probably missed it, but Catherine caught the moment of genuine rage, confirmation that her accusations had hit closer to truth than he'd anticipated she'd be able to aim. Whatever confidence he'd maintained about completely destroying her before she could mount effective defense was cracking, replaced by recognition that she knew more than isolated CEO should possibly know. Daniel stepped forward, then moving from behind Catherine to position where cameras would capture him clearly. His expression was neutral, but his presence was deliberate visual statement that Catherine wasn't alone in her accusations. Richard's gaze shifted to Daniel, and Catherine watched recognition dawn, memory of security director he'd destroyed connecting to Janitor, who'd been invisible for years. Crawford. Richard's voice carried surprise he didn't quite manage to hide. I thought you'd crawled back to whatever hole you've been hiding in since your last employment here ended. So unfortunately. Interesting that you've chosen to involve yourself in Catherine's situation, considering your own documented history of negligence and security failures. The dismissal was automatic. Richard's attempt to undermine Daniel's credibility before he could speak, but Catherine saw calculation behind the words. Richard was reassessing threat level, realizing that Daniel's involvement meant Catherine had access to information and institutional memory that predated her CEO tenure. The warehouse fire that had been successfully buried was suddenly relevant again. Witness who hadn't been properly silenced, emerging from background, Richard had assumed it was safely neutered. My name is Daniel Crawford, and I was Director of Security Infrastructure for this company until Richard Holloway framed me for crimes he committed. Daniel's voice carried across the space with surprising authority, the transformation from invisible janitor to credible accuser happening in real time. I designed every security protocol Brennan Technologies uses. I know how Catherine's credentials were compromised because I know the backdoors that exist in systems I built. I know how Richard has been embezzling funds for years using shell companies and false invoicing. His voice hardened. And I know he murdered my wife along with 22 other workers in a warehouse fire he ordered to collect insurance money, then covered it up by destroying anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The crowd's murmur became louder, hostile certainty beginning to fragment as competing narratives crashed against each other. Media cameras swiveled to capture Daniel's statement, reporters suddenly recognizing they might be witnessing something more complex than straightforward CEO embezzlement story. Richard's expression cycled through surprise, anger, and calculation before settling on dismissive contempt that tried to restore the dynamic he'd been controlling. Those are libelous accusations from a disgruntled former employee who was terminated for cause over safety failures that resulted in tragic loss of life. Richard addressed the cameras rather than Daniel directly. Mr. Crawford has been unable to accept responsibility for his mistakes. and instead has constructed elaborate conspiracy theories to justify his own failures. His involvement with Ms. Brennan only demonstrates that they're both attempting to avoid accountability through baseless accusations against people who've dedicated their careers to building this company ethically. The deflection was skilled Richard painting both Catherine and Daniel as unreliable narrators whose shared grievances made them co-conspirators in false witness rather than independent sources confirming pattern of corruption. But Catherine saw calculation behind the response, Richard assessing how much evidence they actually possessed versus how much was intimidation strategy unsupported by documentation. Then let's resolve this definitively. Catherine spoke before Richard could further poison the narrative. Grant us access to the data vault on level B3, the old server farm that's been offline for 3 years. If Daniel and I are lying, those systems will contain nothing relevant, and you'll have public proof we're making false accusations. But if we're telling the truth, those servers will contain evidence of financial crimes and cover-ups dating back years, documentation that your security team doesn't know exists because it was hidden by someone who understood the systems better than anyone currently on your payroll. The specificity of the challenge changed the dynamic, Catherine moving from vague accusations to concrete proposal that forced Richard into position where refusal would look suspicious. She watched him process the gambit, seeing calculation about whether old servers actually contained anything damaging, whether the data vault had been properly scrubbed during infrastructure upgrades, whether granting access was safer than blocking it. The data vault was decommissioned and decommissioned. Hardware was destroyed per standard security protocol. Richard's response came slightly too quickly, defensive rather than dismissive. There's nothing to access in that section of the building, and I'm not going to validate your conspiracy theories by pretending there's hidden evidence in non-existent systems. Then you won't mind if we verify that personally. Daniel pulled out his phone, began recording video that would document whatever happened next. According to the building schematics and decommissioning reports I've reviewed, the level B3 server farm was powered down, but hardware was never physically removed due to budget constraints during the infrastructure upgrade. The equipment is still there, still contains data, still accessible to anyone with the proper credentials and physical access to that level. His tone was deliberately neutral, laying out facts that invited verification. If you're confident in those systems that contain nothing damaging, granting us access under supervised conditions only strengthens your position by demonstrating you have nothing to hide. The logic was sound enough that blocking access would raise questions about Richard's confidence in his narrative, but granting it would risk exposure if the vault actually contained Michael's hidden evidence. Catherine watched Richard's expression, seeing him calculate odds and assess threats, weighing options that all carried risk. The standoff stretched uncomfortably, crowd watching to see how their previously trusted executives would navigate this unexpected confrontation. Fine. Richard delivered the concession with expression that suggested he was being magnanimous rather than cornered. Under supervised conditions, with building security present, and with explicit understanding that any attempt to tamper with systems or evidence will result in immediate criminal charges. You'll have 2 hours to access whatever you claim is hidden in old server equipment, document it properly, and submit findings to the forensic audit team. His smile turned cold. When you find nothing because there's nothing to find, you'll both leave quietly and let legitimate investigations proceed without further theatrics. The agreement was trap disguised as cooperation. Richard positioning himself as reasonable executive, willing to humor baseless accusations, but Catherine recognized she'd gotten the access Daniel needed even if the conditions were hostile. She nodded once, sharp and economical, accepting terms that might lead to vindication or just give Richard opportunity to document her supposed tampering with evidence. The glass doors unlocked with electronic click that sounded like prison bars opening, Richard stepping aside to permit Catherine and Daniel entry while security closed in around them. The lobby that had been hers yesterday morning now felt like enemy territory, employees watching with expressions that ranged from hostile to confused to sympathetically uncomfortable. Catherine kept her spine straight and her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the scrutiny that felt like physical pressure against her skin. Building security formed escort that was protection and imprisonment, simultaneously 4 guards in company uniforms surrounding Catherine and Daniel with professional distance that communicated authority without overt threat. The lead guard was someone Catherine recognized from morning greetings exchanged in passing Rodriguez or Ramirez, someone she'd smiled at without learning first name because facilities staff existed in her peripheral awareness rather than direct attention. His expression now showed discomfort at the role reversal, former CEO reduced to supervised visitor in buildings she'd once commanded. Level B3 requires special clearance that was revoked when your employment terminated. Rodriguez spoke with careful formality that created distance between professional duty and personal opinion. Mr. Holloway has temporarily reinstated access codes for this inspection, but you're explicitly prohibited from accessing any current systems, touching any equipment on active floors, or attempting to communicate with employees. Violation of these restrictions will result in immediate removal and criminal trespassing charges. The restrictions were comprehensive and designed to prevent Catherine from gathering additional evidence or building employee support, reducing her to observer in her own investigation. Daniel moved closer, not quite touching, but present enough that his proximity felt steadying reminder that she wasn't navigating this alone, even if circumstances felt overwhelmingly isolating. The elevator descent to level B3 took them through the building's hidden infrastructure, past the polished executive floors into utilitarian service areas that existed to support the company's forward-facing operations. Catherine had rarely visited these levels during her tenure as CEO, the basement server rooms and maintenance corridors residing in blind spots of her attention. Now she saw them with new appreciation for how thoroughly a building could hide secrets in spaces leadership never bothered to examine. Level B3 opened into dimness that suggested the space had indeed been abandoned, rather than repurposed emergency lighting, providing barely adequate illumination that cast everything in harsh shadows. The temperature was noticeably colder than upper floors, the HVAC systems apparently deprioritized for areas housing equipment nobody accessed anymore. Dust-covered surfaces that had once been sterile maintenance zones, the particular abandonment of spaces that would eventually be renovated, but currently existed in limbo between uses. Server racks stretched in ordered rows equipment that predated modern infrastructure, but still hummed with residual power despite official decommissioning. Daniel moved through the space with confidence that demonstrated intimate familiarity navigating towards specific rack without needing to check labels or orienteering markers. Catherine followed while security guards maintained perimeter that was observation rather than assistance, documenting everything with body cam footage that would become evidence in whatever legal proceedings followed. Rack 7. Daniel stopped before a unit that looked identical to dozens of others surrounding it, reaching for access panel with practiced efficiency. Michael's final message said the evidence was in a hidden partition on these servers, encrypted with password only he and I would know. He glanced at Catherine. If it's still here, if Richard's security team didn't find it during decommissioning, we'll have everything we need to prove what actually happened. The access panel opened with squeal of hinges that hadn't moved in years, revealing aging servers that should have been recycled during upgrade cycle, but instead sat dormant in darkness, waiting for someone to remember they existed. Daniel pulled laptop from messenger bag he had been carrying, connected cables to server interfaces with the easy competence of someone who'd performed this operation countless times. His fingers moved across keyboard with speed that suggested muscle memory, overriding conscious thought typing commands and passwords that belonged to systems Catherine had never seen during her CEO tenure. The screen flickered with boot sequences, old operating systems waking from years of dormancy, displaying directory structures that had been current when the company was half its present size. Daniel navigated through file systems with the particular confidence of someone who'd built these originally and knew exactly where to look for hidden partitions that wouldn't show up in normal browsing. Catherine watched over his shoulder security guards maintaining positions that were close enough to observe but far enough to allow operational freedom within established parameters. Here, Daniel's voice carried satisfaction mixed with something darker recognition of vindication purchased through years of patience. Michael's insurance partition. He typed password that Catherine glimpsed was combination of dates and names before her view was blocked by Daniel's shoulder, the encryption yielding to credentials that only the two dead men should have possessed. The screen filled with folders organized with meticulous precision, years of documentation compressed into hierarchical structure that demonstrated Michael's systematic approach to collecting evidence. Financial records, security logs, audio recordings, video files, meeting minutes, email archives, personnel, files, accident reports, insurance claims, settlement agreements, regulatory correspondence. Everything cataloged with timestamps and source documentation that established chain of custody and provenance. Catherine leaned closer, scanning file names that suggested comprehensive documentation of crimes spanning back before her involvement with the company. The warehouse fire investigation report, labeled actual rather than official version. Financial audits showing shell companies and money laundering networks. Board meeting transcripts containing discussions that had supposedly been kept off record. Personnel files documenting employees who'd been systematically destroyed for threatening to expose various corruptions. This is everything. Catherine's voice was barely above whisper recognition of how completely Michael had documented the machinery of Richard's criminal enterprise. Every crime, every cover-up, every person destroyed. Years of evidence collected by someone who knew exactly what prosecutors would need to build a comprehensive case. Daniel was already copying files to encrypted drives, multiple backups created in parallel to ensure evidence couldn't be destroyed if Richard moved to prevent its distribution. The security guards shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that whatever they were witnessing might be considerably more significant than the personal grievance drama Richard had characterized. Rodriguez moved closer, looking at the screen with expression that suggested dawning awareness that the narrative he'd accepted might be incomplete. "Ma'am," his formal address couldn't quite hide the uncertainty underneath. "What exactly are we looking at here?" Evidence that Richard Holloway has been running a criminal enterprise through Brennan Technologies for over a decade. Catherine spoke with clarity that came from finally understanding the full scope of what she'd walked into. Financial fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, insurance fraud, negligent homicide, possibly murder. All documented by the former CFO who died suspiciously convenient to when he was planning to take this to federal investigators. Rodriguez exchanged glances with other guards, silent communication about whether they were protecting integrity of investigation or enabling cover-up of crimes that implicated their employer. The moment stretched uncomfortably, loyalty and duty pulling in different directions, the security team caught between orders from executive leadership and evidence of those executives' criminality. The server rack's emergency power supply chose that moment to emit warning beep battery backup beginning to fail after years of supporting systems that should have been fully decommissioned. Daniel cursed softly, fingers moving faster across keyboard as he prioritized which files to copy first, gambling on how much time remained before power failure wiped everything. Catherine felt panic spike recognition that they were minutes or possibly seconds away from losing evidence they couldn't replace. How long? She forced the question to come out calmly, not wanting to distract Daniel from work that required complete focus. 5 minutes, maybe less, before battery backup fails completely. The server's been drawing power longer than its emergency systems were designed to support. Daniel's hands didn't pause, continuing to copy files in order of priority Michael had established through folder organization. "We'll get the critical files, but probably not everything. Need to decide what's most important. Financial records first." Catherine made the call with CEO decisiveness that felt strange given her current status. Bank statements, shell company documentation, money trails that prove where $60 million actually went. Then the warehouse fire investigation and Jennifer's personnel file. Then audio recordings of board meetings. Everything else is supporting detail. Daniel nodded without looking up from screen, redirecting copy operations to match Catherine's priorities. The progress bars crawled with agonizing slowness, each percentage point taking seconds that felt like eternities, while battery warning beeps came faster, more insistent countdown to failure that would erase everything still residing on drives nobody had accessed in years. 70%, 80%. The screen flickered, power supply struggling to maintain consistent voltage system, threatening to fail at any moment. Daniel held his breath, watching files transfer with the focus of someone whose entire mission depended on completion of simple technical task. 90%, 95%. The server emitted final prolonged beep and died, screen going black, the room's ambient noise decreasing as equipment powered down completely. Daniel's laptop showed 97% file transfer completion, close enough to success that it felt like victory, despite the small portion that remained inaccessible. He disconnected cables with careful precision, closed laptop with satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished primary objective, even if circumstances prevented perfection. We have it. The statement was simple and complete confirmation that Michael's evidence had survived long enough to be copied before technological failure erased it permanently. Everything we need to prove Richard's guilt and Catherine's innocence. The financial records, the investigations, the cover-ups. Years of documentation collected by someone who knew exactly what kind of evidence would stand up in court. Catherine felt something loosen in her chest, the first genuine hope she'd experienced since being dragged from her car last night. The evidence existed and was now duplicated beyond Richard's ability to destroy, uploaded to cloud storage, and encrypted drives that could be distributed to investigators and media simultaneously if Richard attempted to suppress it through legal or extra-legal means. The power dynamic that had felt so impossibly weighted against her was beginning to shift, not yet balanced but less catastrophically tilted toward her destruction. The security guards remained uncertain about their role, Rodriguez particularly showing signs of wanting to engage with implications of what he'd witnessed, but unsure how to navigate chain of command that might be implicated in crimes he was suddenly aware existed. Catherine recognized the crisis of loyalty, playing out security staff forced to choose between following orders from executives who paid them and acting on evidence of criminality those executives had committed. I need you to understand what you saw here. Catherine addressed the guards directly, acknowledging their presence as witnesses rather than obstacles. Michael Garrett, the CFO who died of supposed heart attack 6 weeks ago, spent years documenting crimes committed by senior leadership. He hid that documentation in systems he knew wouldn't be examined during normal operations. Daniel and I just copied evidence that proves Richard Holloway has been running criminal enterprise through this company and that the charges against me are fabricated to cover his crimes. Rodriguez's expressions cycled through doubt and consideration. Professional training warring with evidence he couldn't easily dismiss. Ma'am, that's serious allegation. If what you're saying is true, we're obligated to report it through proper channels. But if it's not true, if this is a strategy to avoid prosecution for actual crimes you committed, we're participating in evidence tampering. The dilemma was fair security staff caught between competing claims without obvious way to determine which version deserved belief. Catherine recognized she couldn't force their cooperation, could only present the evidence and trust that truth would eventually matter more than hierarchy. Then review the files yourself. Daniel pulled second encrypted drive from his bag, handed it to Rodriguez with the casual gesture of someone offering proof he knew would withstand examination. Everything Michael collected is here. Financial records that trace $60 million to shell companies Richard controls. Security logs that prove Catherine's credentials were accessed remotely from Richard's office computer. Audio recordings of board meetings where they planned her removal and discussed covering up previous crimes. He paused, letting the weight settle. Or you can give that to Richard and let him destroy it like he's destroyed everyone else who threatened to expose him. Rodriguez held the drive like it was an explosive device that might detonate if handled improperly, the small piece of technology representing decision point that would determine whether he was accomplice to justice or complicit in cover-up. His colleagues watched him with expressions that suggested they'd follow his lead, regardless of which direction he chose. Unity in the security team that came from years of working together. I'll need to review this with my supervisor. Rodriguez's response was professionally non-committal, refusing to commit before understanding full implications. But I'm documenting everything that happened here, including Ms. Brennan's claims and the evidence Mr. Crawford provided. If there's criminal activity, it needs to be investigated properly regardless of who it implicates. The answer wasn't enthusiastic support, but it also wasn't immediate betrayal, security staff maintaining enough independence to consider evidence before choosing sides. Catherine recognized it was probably the best outcome she could expect, given circumstances that demanded everyone navigate complex loyalties and uncertain consequences. The elevator ride back to ground level felt different than descent, had Catherine and Daniel now carrying evidence that transformed their status from desperate accusers to credible witnesses with documentation. The security guards maintained professional distance, but the dynamic had shifted subtly, Rodriguez in particular, showing body language that suggested he was reconsidering who deserved protection and who represented threat. The lobby remained crowded when they emerged, media crews and employees waiting to see what would happen next in drama that had been unfolding since yesterday. Richard stood where they'd left him, surrounded by board members whose expressions suggested growing awareness that the situation had evolved beyond their planned script. He saw Catherine and Daniel emerge, and his smile tightened calculation about whether the data vault inspection had uncovered anything significant. Well, Richard projected confidence that looked increasingly performative. I trust you found nothing in the decommissioned server farm just as I indicated. Now perhaps you can stop wasting everyone's time with conspiracy theories and allow actual investigations to proceed. Catherine held up encrypted drive Daniel had given her, small device that contained power to destroy everything Richard had built through decades of systematic criminality. Actually, we found comprehensive documentation of your crimes spanning back years before I joined this company. Financial records, security logs, audio recordings, personnel files. Everything Michael Garrett collected before you had him murdered. Everything that proves the $60 million was stolen by you, not me. Everything that proves you've been running criminal enterprise through Brennan Technologies while positioning yourself as ethical leader. The lobby went completely silent, every person present recognizing they were witnessing something considerably more significant than anticipated. Richard's expression flickered through several emotions before settling on cold fury that he didn't quite manage to hide behind professional mask. The cameras captured everything, documenting the moment when narrative began shifting from Catherine's guilt to Richard's, though the full reversal would take hours or days to complete. Those are serious allegations that I'm confident have no foundation in reality. Richard's voice remained controlled, but carried undercurrent of threat that suggested he was done being patient with subordinates who'd forgotten their place. If you've tampered with company property or fabricated evidence to support your false claims, you'll face additional criminal charges on top of the embezzlement charges already filed. Then let's resolve this definitively. Catherine pulled out her phone, began uploading files to cloud storage, even while holding Richard's gaze. I'm sending everything to the FBI, to every major media outlet, to cybersecurity researchers who can verify authenticity, and to shareholders who have right to know what's been happening with their investment. Within the hour, everyone will have access to evidence Michael Garrett collected. Then we can let investigators and the public decide whose version of events is supported by documentation. The threat was nuclear option releasing information before Richard could prepare counter-narrative or use his influence to shape investigation's direction. Catherine knew it was risky, that going public before careful legal strategy was built meant she couldn't control the message, but she also recognized that Richard's connections and resources meant any conventional approach would allow him to maintain advantage. Better to flood the zone with evidence and force response than let him orchestrate her destruction at his leisure. You're making a serious mistake. Richard's voice dropped to barely above whisper, threat that didn't need volume to convey menace. Whatever you think you found, whatever stories Daniel has convinced you are true, you're destroying your own future by pursuing this course. Reputational damage can't be undone. Once you're labeled as conspiracy theorist who fabricated evidence to avoid prosecution, you'll never work in this industry again. I'm already labeled as embezzler who betrayed everyone's trust. Catherine spoke loudly enough that cameras would capture every word. My reputation is already destroyed, my career already over, according to news coverage from last night. I have nothing left to lose by fighting back with truth, regardless of whether powerful people want that truth to stay hidden. The standoff stretched uncomfortably, Richard clearly calculating whether he could prevent Catherine's information release through force or legal intervention, recognizing that his control over the situation was slipping away with every second she remained capable of acting independently. His gaze shifted to security guards' unspoken command to intervene before she could complete whatever action she was threatening. Rodriguez stepped forward, positioned himself between Richard and Catherine, with body language that suggested he'd made decision about which side of history he wanted to occupy. Sir, I've reviewed preliminary evidence Ms. Brennan and Mr. Crawford obtained from the server vault. Their allegations appear to have substantial documentation supporting them. I think we need to secure all parties and evidence pending a comprehensive investigation rather than allowing any additional actions that might compromise the integrity of whatever proceedings follow. The statement was professionally neutral, but the positioning was clear: security staff choosing to preserve evidence rather than assist in its suppression. Richard's expression went through several transformations before settling on cold fury that promised retaliation once he regained control. He turned to Patricia Voss and the other board members' silent communication about whether they needed to abandon ship or circle wagons more tightly. "You're all witnesses to this," Richard addressed the crowd, cameras, posterity. "Catherine Brennan is attempting to destroy this company through false allegations because she can't accept responsibility for her own crimes. Whatever evidence she claims to possess is either fabricated or grossly misinterpreted by someone with clear motivation to avoid prosecution." His voice strengthened with conviction of someone who'd survived previous challenges through maintaining aggressive offense. "The board stands behind our previous decisions, and we're confident that proper investigation will vindicate our actions and reveal Ms. Brennan's true culpability. Then we'll see what investigators determine when they have access to complete evidence rather than just the narrative you have been controlling." Catherine's phone chimed with confirmation that Upload had completed files now distributed beyond Richard's reach to multiple destinations simultaneously. Everything Michael Garrett documented is now public record. The financial crimes, the warehouse fire, cover up the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened to expose your operation. Let the truth speak for itself. The moment crystallized into something that felt simultaneously triumphant and terrifying: the recognition that Catherine had just detonated her nuclear option without knowing for certain whether the fallout would vindicate her or complete her destruction. The evidence was real and substantial, but Richard had resources and influence. She couldn't match ability to shape narratives and pressure investigators and deploy lawyers who'd make every claim complex and contested. The battle was far from over, possibly just beginning, but at least now it was being fought with something approaching equal access to information. Richard turned and walked back into the building's interior, his board members following like loyal soldiers, maintaining formation, even as their general's strategy began showing fatal flaws. The crowd remained uncertain, employees and media trying to process reversal of established narrative, not yet sure which version of events deserved belief, but recognizing that the story had become considerably more complicated than they'd been told. Catherine felt exhaustion crash over her, like wave that had been held back through adrenaline and necessity, the accumulated weight of 30 hours without real sleep combined with stress that would have broken someone less stubborn. She swayed slightly, caught herself, felt Daniel's hand on her elbow, steadying her with the same gentle firmness he'd demonstrated in the parking garage when this nightmare had begun. "You need rest." Daniel spoke quietly, meant only for her rather than the crowd still documenting every moment. "We've done what we could for now. Evidence is distributed, investigators will have to engage with it, media will cover the story from multiple angles. Best thing you can do is find somewhere safe and let the process unfold rather than pushing until you collapse from exhaustion." The advice was sound but felt impossible to accept. Catherine's mind racing through next steps and contingency plans, and the thousand things that needed management before she could permit herself the luxury of rest. But Daniel was right that she was operating on fumes, that continuing would lead to mistakes that might undo whatever progress they'd achieved. "Where do I go?" The question emerged smaller than Catherine intended. Recognition that she had no home that felt safe anymore. No place that Richard couldn't reach if he decided physical intimidation was necessary to prevent her from causing further damage. Her apartment would be under surveillance, hotels would be discoverable through credit cards, friends' houses would implicate them in whatever legal battles followed. "My place." Daniel spoke with certainty that suggested he'd already thought through logistics. "Small apartment in Brighton Park, not connected to you or the company in any way Richard would think to check. You can sleep, clean up, eat something more substantial than coffee and adrenaline. Give yourself a few hours to recover before dealing with whatever comes next." The offer was practical and necessary, and carried in implications. Catherine was too exhausted to fully process the intimacy of accepting shelter from someone she'd known less than 24 hours. But Daniel had proven himself trustworthy in ways that mattered more than conventional timeline for building relationships allied by shared enemy and complementary need for vindication. "Okay." Catherine nodded, decision made through absence of better alternatives. "But first I need to call my lawyer or find a lawyer, since my current one is probably conflicted out by representing the company. And contact the FBI directly to ensure they actually receive the evidence rather than having it filtered through Richard's connections. And send messages to investors letting them know there's another side to the story they've been told. Her mental list kept expanding, the obligations accumulating faster than she could address them. All of which you can do from somewhere that isn't this lobby being recorded by every camera in Chicago. Daniel began guiding her toward exit, moving through crowd that parted uncertainly, employees who 30 minutes ago had been convinced of her guilt, now unsure what to believe. One face emerged from the crowd, young woman Catherine recognized as Melissa Park, the intern who'd spat at her feet during earlier humiliation. Ms. Brennan? Melissa's voice cracked with emotion that might have been shame or uncertainty, or the particular anguish of recognizing you'd enthusiastically participated in public shaming of potentially innocent person. I owe you an apology. We all do. The intern gestured vaguely at the assembled crowd. We believed what we were told without questioning whether it was true. I'm sorry I treated you like criminal without waiting to hear your side of the story. Catherine studied the young woman, seeing genuine regret mixed with confusion about how to navigate situation where established authorities had proven themselves unreliable. The apology was incomplete and insufficient, and possibly the most honest thing anyone had said to her since the nightmare began. Thank you for saying that. Catherine kept her voice gentle despite exhaustion and stress that made every interaction feel like additional weight on shoulders already compressed past breaking point. Everyone makes mistakes, especially when powerful people coordinate their stories to ensure only one narrative is heard. The important thing is being willing to reconsider when new evidence emerges, rather than doubling down on initial conclusions regardless of what truth reveals. She paused before adding, I hope Brennan Technologies survives this regardless of who ends up leading it. The company's work matters more than any individual's reputation. The statement was diplomatic and possibly true, though Catherine wasn't certain she actually believed it given how personal the betrayal felt. But Melissa needed absolution more than Catherine needed to express the full depth of her anger and hurt, and sometimes leadership meant providing grace, even when every instinct demanded something raw. The walk to Daniel's car felt endless, cameras following their departure, reporters shouting questions Catherine didn't have energy to answer coherently. Daniel moved with practiced efficiency, navigating crowd and traffic with the competence of someone accustomed to operating in hostile environments. His vehicle was an old sedan that had seen better years but remained mechanically sound, the kind of anonymous transportation that wouldn't attract attention in neighborhoods where expensive cars invited theft. The drive through Chicago took them from downtown's glass towers into residential areas that felt simultaneously safer and more exposed, leaving behind the corporate battlefield for streets where Catherine's problems didn't yet matter. Daniel navigated with confidence that suggested intimate knowledge of the city's geography, taking routes that avoided obvious surveillance, and delivered them to modest apartment building in Brighton Park. Home sweet home. Daniel's dry delivery acknowledged the contrast between this space and the professional life Catherine had inhabited until yesterday. Small, probably not what you're used to, but it's secure and nobody knows to look for you here. He unlocked the building's entrance, led her up 2 flights of stairs to an apartment that smelled like coffee and old books in the particular emptiness of space occupied by someone who'd been living alone too long. The apartment was exactly what Daniel had advertised, small and clean and furnished with the practical minimalism of someone who'd long ago stopped caring about aesthetic presentation. But photographs on the walls suggested warmth beneath the surface austerity, pictures of Daniel with young girl at various ages smiling together in parks and museums and ordinary moments of family life that had continued despite tragedy that preceded them. Your daughter. Catherine studied a recent photo showing Daniel and girl, who looked maybe 9 years old, both wearing matching silly grins at some event or celebration. Sophie, 9 years old, currently at school and blissfully unaware that her father just committed several acts that might get him arrested or worse. Daniel's tone carried both pride and worry, the dual consciousness of parent who wanted to protect their child while also believing some fights were worth the risk. She lost her mother when she was 2, doesn't really remember Jennifer except through photos and stories. But she deserves better future than one where people like Richard get away with murder because they're rich and connected enough to escape accountability. The words landed with weight of motivation that explained Daniel's willingness to risk everything, the parents' conviction that protecting the next generation mattered more than preserving personal comfort. Catherine felt kinship with that impulse, even though she had no children of her own, the sense that some principles deserve defense regardless of cost. Get some sleep. Daniel gestured toward a bedroom that clearly belonged to Sophie based on the decorations and stuffed animals scattered across surfaces. She's at school until 3. You can use her room until then. I'll handle the immediate calls you mentioned, contact criminal defense attorneys. I've been researching in case we needed them. Ensure the FBI actually receives the evidence rather than having it buried by whoever Richard has on his payroll. Catherine wanted to protest that she should handle her own crisis rather than delegating to someone who'd already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. But exhaustion was pulling her toward unconsciousness with irresistible force. She made it to Sophie's bed before collapsing into sleep that claimed her completely, the accumulated stress of 36 hours, finally demanding payment that couldn't be deferred any longer. Dreams came fragmented and anxious replays of Richard's mocking toast mixed with warehouse fires and board meetings and the particular nightmare of being accused of crimes you didn't commit, while everyone you trusted believed the accusations. Catherine woke repeatedly to unfamiliar ceiling and the disorientation of sleeping in child's bedroom in apartment belonging to man she'd known less than 2 days. Each time she drifted back into exhausted unconsciousness until mid-afternoon light through curtains finally pulled her into sustained waking. The apartment was quiet, Daniel presumably still making calls on her behalf, or possibly sleeping himself after his own overnight shift. Catherine found clean towels and bathroom, took shower that felt like washing away layers of stress, even though nothing fundamental had changed. Her clothes from yesterday were rumpled and inappropriate, but she had nothing else. Another small reminder of how completely her life had been disrupted in time frame that still felt surreally compressed. Daniel appeared when she emerged from bathroom looking less exhausted than she felt, but still carrying weight of too many hours without real rest. He handed her mug of coffee that smelled like the most perfect thing Catherine had ever encountered, warmth and caffeine and the particular comfort of small normal gesture in circumstances that had been aggressively abnormal. FBI wants to interview you this evening. Daniel delivered the information without preamble recognition that Catherine needed facts more than gentle easing into difficult conversations. They've reviewed preliminary evidence you uploaded, confirmed it's substantial enough to warrant investigation separate from the embezzlement charges Richard filed. Agent named Sarah Martinez will meet you at 6 p.m. at their Chicago field office, neutral territory, rather than either party's advantage. The news was better than Catherine had dared hope. Confirmation that federal investigators were engaging with evidence rather than dismissing it as desperate fabrication by guilty executive. The relief was tempered by recognition that this also meant she was now formally subject to investigation, even if the parameters had shifted from simple target to more complex participant in situation requiring comprehensive examination. What about the media coverage? Catherine hadn't checked her phone since uploading the files, deliberately avoiding the feeding frenzy she'd triggered by making everything public simultaneously. Daniel pulled out his tablet, showed her search results that demonstrated the story had exploded exactly as Catherine had intended. Business media was covering the allegations from multiple angles. Technology blogs were analyzing the technical details of the frame-up. Cybersecurity researchers were confirming the authenticity of security logs. Financial journalists were tracing money through shell companies. Richard had issued statements denying everything Patricia Voss had declared. The board stood behind previous decisions, pending investigation. Several board members had quietly resigned, citing personal reasons. More importantly, employees were beginning to speak publicly about the toxic culture Richard had cultivated. Former workers who'd left under suspicious circumstances were sharing their stories. Regulatory officials who'd been pressured to overlook violations were finding courage to admit they'd been compromised. The dam was breaking, the systematic suppression of truth collapsing under weight of accumulated evidence and testimony from people who'd previously been too afraid or isolated to speak up. It's working. Catherine felt something like hope beginning to germinate beneath the exhaustion and stress. The strategy of overwhelming the system with information instead of trying to fight through proper channels where Richard had advantage. People are listening, investigators are engaging. The narrative is shifting from my guilt to comprehensive investigation of everything Richard has been doing. Don't celebrate yet. Daniel's caution was grounded in experience that recognized powerful people didn't fall without fighting back hard. Richard has resources we can't match, connections throughout law enforcement, in media, and financial systems. He'll be deploying lawyers and public relations teams and every favor he's accumulated over decades. This is going to get uglier before it gets better, and there's no guarantee justice actually prevails, regardless of how damning the evidence appears. The warning was necessary reality check reminder that releasing evidence and securing investigation didn't automatically translate to accountability for crimes committed. Catherine had spent enough years navigating corporate and legal systems to understand that truth alone wasn't sufficient when arrayed against coordinated defense mounted by someone with Richard's advantages. Then we keep fighting. Catherine spoke with determination that surprised her given the exhaustion still weighing down her limbs. We provide whatever investigators need, cooperate completely. Make sure every question gets answered with documentation rather than rhetoric. We trust that enough people care about truth to prevent Richard from burying everything through procedural manipulation. The afternoon passed in blur of phone calls and email exchanges in preparation for evening FBI interview that would determine how seriously federal investigators took the evidence Catherine and Daniel had provided. Lawyers were contacted and retained, financial records were organized and annotated. Timeline was constructed, documenting every relevant event. The mechanical work of building legal defense replaced the dramatic confrontation of mourning different kind of exhausting that required precision rather than courage. Sophie arrived home from school at 3:30, burst into apartment with 9-year-old energy that transformed the space from war room into family home. She stopped when she saw Catherine curiosity replacing exuberance as she processed the presence of unexpected guests in her father's apartment. "Who's this, Dad?" The question was direct without being rude, child's natural interest in understanding her environment. "This is Ms. Catherine Brennan." Daniel performed introductions with easy warmth that suggested he was comfortable navigating between his roles as single father and reluctant crusader. "She's going through a difficult situation and needed safe place to stay for a while. I'm helping her with some problems related to work." Sophie studied Catherine with the particular intensity of children who haven't yet learned to disguise assessment of strangers. "You look really tired, like when Dad works too many night shifts and forgets to sleep properly. Should you be resting instead of working on more problems?" The observation was accurate enough that Catherine almost laughed, despite everything child's wisdom cutting through adult complications to fundamental truth that she was operating beyond sustainable limits. "You're absolutely right. I should be resting more. Your father's been very kind to help me when I didn't have anywhere else to go." Sophie accepted this explanation with the easy trust of child whose father had proven himself reliable, then shifted into recounting her day at school with enthusiasm that made adult concerns feel temporarily distant. Catherine found herself drawn into the rhythms of family dinner and homework supervision and the ordinary domestic routines that had been completely absent from her work-focused existence. The normalcy was both jarring and healing reminder that life continued in patterns unaffected by corporate catastrophes that felt world-ending to those directly involved. The evening FBI interview approached with weight of moment that would determine trajectory of everything that followed. Catherine dressed in business casual that projected competence without suggesting she was trying too hard armor for conversation that would be professionally cordial and personally devastating. Daniel drove her downtown to Federal Building that housed Chicago field office navigating evening traffic with practiced efficiency. "You'll do fine." His encouragement came as they pulled up to security checkpoint. "Just tell the truth completely. Don't try to guess what they want to hear." Investigators respect directness more than calculated performance, especially when the evidence already supports your version of events. Catherine nodded, stepping out into cold evening air that made her shiver despite coat that should have been sufficient protection. The Federal Building was all concrete and security and the particular gravitas of spaces where power was exercised without theatricality. Agent Sarah Martinez met her in lobby 40-something Latina woman with military bearing and expression that suggested she'd heard every possible lie and remained unimpressed by creative attempts at deception. "Ms. Brennan," the greeting was professional and economical. "Thank you for coming in voluntarily. We have quite a bit to discuss regarding the evidence you uploaded this morning and the allegations you've made against Richard Holloway and others at Brennan Technologies. This conversation will be recorded and may be used in any subsequent legal proceedings. You have right to attorney present if you wish. My attorney is reviewing the evidence package I provided, but couldn't be here this evening on short notice. Catherine kept her voice steady despite nerves that made her hands want to shake. I'm comfortable proceeding with preliminary interview with understanding that more detailed conversations may require legal counsel present as we get into specifics of the financial crimes and other allegations. Agent Martinez led Catherine through security to interview room that looked exactly like television had taught her to expect plain table and uncomfortable chairs and recording equipment visible on walls. Two other agents joined them, both male, one older and one younger, establishing dynamic where Martinez would lead, but colleagues would observe and occasionally interject. The questions began systematically walking through timeline and relationships and the specific evidence Catherine had provided. Hours passed in detailed examination of every claim, every document, every conversation that supported allegations against Richard. Catherine answered with precision that came from having reviewed evidence, exhaustively providing context and clarification, while resisting temptation to oversell conclusions that evidence should speak to directly. The agents were professional and thorough, occasionally skeptical, but never dismissive, following threads that suggested they were building comprehensive understanding rather than looking for easy way to close investigation. By the time they concluded after 10 p.m., Catherine felt wrung out, but cautiously optimistic that she'd been taken seriously as witness rather than treated as suspect attempting to deflect blame. Martinez walked her back to lobby, expression giving nothing away but tone suggesting something approaching respect for how Catherine had handled extended interrogation. We'll be in touch as investigation proceeds. The FBI agent handed Catherine business card with contact information. In the meantime, I'd recommend you remain available and refrain from any actions that might be construed as obstruction or witness tampering. Mr. Holloway will undoubtedly be mounting aggressive defense, but that's not your concern beyond cooperating with our investigation and letting the process unfold properly. The professional distance was appropriate, but Catherine wanted more needed explicit confirmation that investigators believed her version of events rather than Richard's recognition that truth mattered more than power and connections. But Agent Martinez was already turning away, returning to work that demanded objectivity, rather than providing emotional reassurance to witnesses whose lives had been destroyed by crimes she was investigating. Daniel was waiting in parking garage where she'd left him patient and present, and exactly the kind of steady competence Catherine had needed without knowing how to ask for it. She collapsed into his passenger seat, feeling every minute of the 16-hour day that had started with data vault inspection and ended with FBI interrogation. How did it go? Daniel pulled out of federal building's parking structure, navigating toward his apartment with route selection that suggested he was checking for surveillance. Catherine thought about the question, trying to distill hours of detailed testimony into summary that captured essential truth. They're taking it seriously, really investigating rather than just going through motions before endorsing whatever Richard claims. But Martinez made clear this will take time, that I need to be patient while they build comprehensive case rather than expecting immediate vindication. Her voice cracked slightly. I don't know if I have patience left, Dan. I'm exhausted and scared and so tired of fighting. Then rest tonight. Tomorrow you keep fighting. Daniel's response was simple and complete, acknowledging exhaustion while refusing to permit surrender. We've come this far, gotten federal investigators engaged, distributed evidence beyond Richard's ability to suppress. The hard part isn't over, but the momentum has shifted. Sometimes victory is just refusing to quit long enough for truth to catch up with lies. Catherine closed her eyes, let Daniel's words settle over her like blanket that couldn't provide actual warmth, but suggested comfort might be possible eventually. The city slid past outside windows, Chicago at night, indifferent to her struggles, millions of people navigating their own difficulties, without knowing or caring that somewhere in the machine, a corporate executive was learning that building empires on lies was ultimately unsustainable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Richard's counteroffensive media scrutiny, legal proceedings that would drag on for months or possibly years. But tonight she was alive, free, surrounded by people who believed her story and were willing to fight beside her. Sometimes that had to be enough. They returned to Daniel's apartment, where Sophie was already asleep, the 9-year-old who represented everything worth protecting about future generations. Catherine looked at photos on walls showing father and daughter navigating life together after tragedy, building something good from foundation of loss. The images felt like promise that healing was possible even when damage seemed irreparable, that integrity eventually mattered even when consequences felt overwhelming. Daniel set up sleeping arrangements, gave Catherine the space she needed to process day that had required more than anyone should have to endure. When she finally collapsed into exhausted sleep on pull-out couch, the last thought before unconsciousness was gratitude for Allah. She'd never expected to find Janitor, who turned out to be architect, friend, and possibly savior, all compressed into person who'd spent 5 years learning to be invisible before stepping forward exactly when visibility mattered most. Somewhere in Chicago, Richard Holloway was probably deploying his resources, preparing counterattack, convinced that power and connections would ultimately prevail over evidence and testimony. But Catherine had survived the worst he could throw at her: initial assault, distributed information beyond his reach, engaged investigators with resources to match his own. The fight was far from over, possibly just beginning, but at least now it was being fought with something approaching fair terms. The truth was out. Everything else would follow from that simple fact, for better or worse, whatever consequences emerged from refusing to accept destruction quietly. Morning arrived with the particular brutality of sunlight against exhaustion that hadn't been adequately addressed by 5 hours of fitful sleep. Catherine woke on Daniel's pull-out couch to the smell of coffee and the sound of Sophie getting ready for school, domestic normalcy that felt surreal given the previous day's systematic destruction of her professional life. Her phone showed 73 missed calls and 214 unread messages, the digital manifestation of a world that had continued spinning while she'd been unconscious. The news coverage had metastasized overnight, Catherine's story dominating business media with the kind of attention that destroyed careers regardless of eventual verdicts. But the narrative had fractured in ways Richard clearly hadn't anticipated, competing versions proliferating faster than any single authority could control. Some outlets still reported her as embezzler, attempting desperate deflection, while others had shifted to investigating Richard's history, uncovering patterns that corroborated Michael's documentation. The uncertainty was better than unified condemnation, even if it meant living in liminal space where truth remained contested. Daniel emerged from his bedroom, looking like he'd slept even less than Catherine, dark circles under eyes that suggested he'd spent the night monitoring developments and preparing for inevitable escalation. He handed her coffee without speaking, the gesture carrying more weight than words could have provided acknowledgement that they were in this together, regardless of where the investigation ultimately led. "Your lawyer called at 6 a.m. Daniel's voice was rough from too little sleep and too much coffee. "Rebecca Santos, criminal defense attorney. I retained on your behalf. She's reviewed the evidence package and wants to meet this morning before Richard's team can establish narrative advantages. She thinks we have strong case but needs to coordinate strategy before you give any more statements to investigators or media." The practicality of legal representation forced Catherine back into strategic thinking, recognizing that raw evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient against lawyers Richard could afford. She showered quickly in Daniel's cramped bathroom, dressed in yesterday's clothes that marked her as someone whose life had been disrupted beyond ability to access basic necessities, armor of vulnerability that might actually serve her better than the polished executive image she'd cultivated for years. Rebecca Santos's office occupied third floor of building in the loop modest space that suggested competence without the marble and mahogany excess of firms that charged 4 figures hourly. The attorney was younger than Catherine expected, maybe 40, with the particular intensity of someone who'd built reputation on defending unpopular clients successfully. Her handshake was firm, and her expression suggested she'd already formed preliminary opinions about the case based on overnight review. "You're in significantly better position than most clients who walk through that door facing federal charges." Rebecca gestured for Catherine and Daniel to sit, spreading documents across her desk with practiced efficiency. "The evidence Michael Garrett collected is comprehensive and well documented. Chain of custody is solid, and the fact that you immediately went to investigators rather than trying to hide suggests consciousness of innocence that prosecutors will have difficulty arguing against. But," Catherine heard the unspoken qualification hanging in the air between them, the recognition that strong defense didn't guarantee victory when arrayed against opponent with Richard's resources. "But Richard Holloway has retained Morrison & Price, the firm that specializes in defending corporate executives against fraud charges." Rebecca pulled up news coverage on her laptop showing press release announcing Richard's legal team. They're already planning stories about your supposed instability, suggesting Michael Garrett was manipulated by disgruntled former employee, with vendetta characterizing Daniel as conspiracy theorist who never recovered from his wife's death. The defense strategy is going to be attacking your credibility and motives, rather than engaging with the evidence directly. Catherine had expected this, the inevitable pivot to character assassination, when facts proved inconvenient, but seeing it articulated so clearly made her stomach clench with recognition of battles ahead. Let them attack my character. I have contemporaneous documentation proving I was out of state when transfers allegedly occurred. I have email records showing I questioned irregularities that Richard dismissed as normal fluctuations. I have performance reviews and board minutes establishing that I was effective CEO with no motive for embezzlement when the company was profitable and my compensation was already substantial. All of which helps your defense against embezzlement charges. Rebecca's expression suggested she was leading toward more difficult truth, but doesn't necessarily help with the defamation and interference charges Richard filed against you this morning. She slid legal documents across the desk, complaints alleging that Catherine had knowingly made false statements, damaging Richard's reputation, that she tortiously interfered with business relationships by distributing information she knew or should have known was fabricated, that she'd conspired with Daniel to create fake evidence for purposes of avoiding criminal liability. The charges were offensive legal strategy disguised as defensive response, Richard using civil litigation to create parallel narrative, where Catherine was aggressor rather than victim. The timing suggested coordination with criminal defense, establishing framework where every action Catherine took to defend herself could be recharacterized as further evidence of malicious intent. He's trying to bankrupt me with legal fees before a criminal case even reaches trial. Catherine recognized the strategy immediately, the way wealthy defendants weaponize civil litigation to exhaust opponents' resources. Even if I ultimately win, defending against these charges will cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees I don't have access to since my assets are frozen pending investigation. Which is why we need to be strategic about where we engage and where we let public opinion do the work. Rebecca began outlining an approach that balanced aggressive defense with resource conservation. We focus on criminal charges because those are existential threat. We document everything Richard does in civil litigation that demonstrates consciousness of guilt pattern of using legal system to silence accusers. We work with journalists covering the story to ensure competing narrative gets equal play. And we trust that federal investigators will follow evidence regardless of how much money Richard throws at private attorneys. The morning dissolved into strategic planning, Rebecca walking them through likely prosecution timeline and defense strategies Richard's team would deploy. By noon, Catherine had signed retainer agreements that would consume what little liquid assets she could access, committed to legal strategy that felt simultaneously aggressive and defensive, accepted that her immediate future would be measured in court filings and depositions, rather than the operational challenges she'd trained for as CEO. Daniel had remained quiet throughout, listening with intensity that suggested he was cataloging every detail for future reference. When Rebecca finally released them with instructions to avoid any public statements without legal review, he waited until they were back in his car before speaking the question Catherine had seen forming behind his eyes. There's something else in Michael's files I didn't show you yesterday. His voice carried weight of decision, delayed but no longer avoidable. Something about your appointment as CEO 8 years ago, about why Richard really brought you into the company and positioned you for leadership role. Catherine felt cold certainty settle in her chest. Recognition that whatever Daniel was about to reveal would recontextualize everything she'd believed about her professional rise. Show me. They drove to public library instead of returning to Daniel's apartment, using terminal in back corner where privacy was nominal, but surveillance was less likely than at either of their residences. Daniel pulled up encrypted files on Michael's backup drive, navigating to folder labeled simply Catherine, an organizational scheme that suggested the CFO had anticipated needing to explain her role to her eventually. The documents told story Catherine had never suspected timeline that began 9 years ago, when Richard had orchestrated removal of previous CEO through similar tactics he'd just deployed against her. That executive had been asking uncomfortable questions about warehouse fire settlements, pushing for independent investigation, threatening to expose patterns Richard couldn't allow examined. So Richard had manufactured financial irregularities, planted evidence, destroyed reputation and career, with same systematic efficiency he'd applied to Catherine. But board had pushed back that time, insisted on more oversight, demanded new CEO with unquestionable ethics, who couldn't be controlled through normal mechanisms of corporate influence. Richard needed someone who appeared independent while actually being vulnerable to manipulation. He hadn't yet deployed someone whose loyalty could be cultivated through mentorship before being weaponized when circumstances demanded. Catherine Sterling had been perfect candidate, brilliant and ambitious, and young enough to be flattered by attention from industry veteran. Richard had recruited her specifically because her relative inexperience made her grateful for guidance, because her integrity made her unwitting shield against accusations of corruption, because her success would reflect well on mentor who'd believed in her. Every career milestone had been calculated investment in puppet who wouldn't recognize strings until they had already tightened beyond escape. The documentation was comprehensive and devastating emails between Richard and board members discussing Catherine's psychology and exploitable weaknesses, performance reviews that praised her competence while noting her dependency on Richard's approval, strategic planning documents that positioned her as expendable asset when more valuable opportunity emerged. 8 years of her professional life reconstructed as elaborate manipulation, every triumph revealed as permitted success within boundaries established by someone who'd always planned her eventual destruction. Catherine stared at the screen, feeling something fundamental crack inside her understanding of who she was and how she'd gotten here. Every conversation with Richard replayed with new context, every piece of advice reinterpreted as grooming rather than mentorship. Every expression of confidence revealed as investment in asset that would maximize value when liquidated. The professional identity she'd built with such effort was fiction, authored by someone who'd seen her as tool rather than person. I should have told you yesterday. Daniel's voice was gentle with understanding of exactly what this revelation cost. But you were already dealing with so much, and I wasn't sure you could handle knowing that even your success was manufactured by the person who destroyed you. Michael documented it because he knew you'd eventually need to understand the full scope of Richard's manipulation, but he also knew it would be devastating to learn that nothing about your career was actually yours. The anger came slowly building from hollow recognition into something hot and clarifying that burned away the numbness. Richard hadn't just destroyed her, he'd never allowed her to exist as anything except his creation, his tool, his eventual sacrifice. Every moment of pride in her accomplishments was retroactively poisoned by understanding that they'd been permitted rather than earned, that her entire professional identity was performance in play, where she'd been audience and actor simultaneously without recognizing the script. This makes it worse. Catherine's voice shook with fury she couldn't fully contain. The embezzlement charges I could handle because I knew I was innocent. But this knowing that everything I built was really his, that my success was always intended to make his betrayal more devastating. Her hands clenched into fists. He didn't just frame me for crimes, he made my entire career into a weapon against me, which is why we use it against him. Daniel spoke with quiet intensity that demanded Catherine's focus. This documentation proves premeditation spanning years, shows pattern of behavior where he systematically destroys people after using them, demonstrates that your appointment as CEO was part of long-term strategy to create expendable scapegoat when opportunity arose. He met her eyes with conviction that cut through her spiral into despair. This doesn't make you less competent or less worthy, Catherine. It makes him a predator who spent years planning to destroy you. And predators who plan that carefully leave trails that can be followed back to every other victim. The reframing helps slightly, transforming revelation from evidence of her inadequacy into documentation of Richard's systematic criminality. But the emotional damage would take longer to process than tactical advantage could address the wound to her self-concept too deep to heal through strategic repositioning. Catherine's phone buzzed with incoming call from Agent Martinez, the FBI investigator who'd interviewed her yesterday. She answered with trepidation, born from knowing that federal attention could mean breakthrough or disaster with equal probability. "Ms. Brennan, we need to meet. Immediately." Martinez's voice carried urgency that suggested significant developments. Don't go home. Don't go to any location associated with you. Is there a secure location you can access within the hour? Catherine exchanged glances with Daniel, seeing her own concern reflected in his expression. What's happened? Richard Holloway has filed emergency protective order claiming you and Mr. Crawford pose imminent threat to his physical safety based on alleged history of violence and unstable behavior. Martinez's tone suggested professional frustration with legal maneuvering that complicated legitimate investigation. The order includes search warrant for any devices or locations you've accessed in past 72 hours, ostensibly looking for evidence of threats, but actually designed to seize the evidence you've collected. We need to secure that material before local law enforcement executes warrant. The escalation was breathtaking in its speed and comprehensive in its threat, Richard deploying legal weapons that would allow him to search Daniel's apartment, where backup evidence was stored to paint Catherine as dangerous rather than victimized, to force her into defensive crouch that prevented aggressive pursuit of charges against him. The strategy revealed desperation beneath polished defense recognition that evidence was damaging enough to require extraordinary measures for suppression. How long do I have? Catherine forced herself to think tactically, despite panic spiking through her nervous system. Hours, maybe less. Martinez's response confirmed the urgency. I can provide protective custody if you surrender voluntarily, which would prevent local law enforcement from executing warrant in hostile fashion. But I need you here within 2 hours, and I need any evidence you're holding secured through proper channels, rather than being vulnerable to seizure by people who might lose it accidentally during processing. Catherine looked at Daniel, silently communicating the impossible choice between surrendering to federal custody and remaining free but vulnerable to local police who might be less interested in preserving evidence than in executing Richard's legal strategy. His expression was grim, but certain recognition that the trap was closing and their options had narrowed to degrees of disadvantage rather than any position that felt like winning. We'll be there in 90 minutes. Catherine made the decision that felt slightly less catastrophic than alternatives. And we're bringing encrypted backups of everything Michael Garrett collected, plus documentation of Richard's attempts to suppress evidence through legal harassment. This goes on record as him trying to destroy documentation of his crimes rather than us being threats he needs protection from. Smart. Martinez's approval was economical. Southeast entrance, ask for me specifically. And Miss Brennan, don't bring anything with you that could be characterized as weapon. Don't make any stops that could be argued as opportunity to dispose of evidence. Come straight here, and we'll handle this properly rather than letting Holloway control the narrative. The call ended, and Catherine sat in a library terminal, surrounded by people researching resume tips and checking social media, completely unaware that in their midst, someone's life was collapsing in real time. Daniel was already copying files to multiple encrypted drives, his movements efficient and practiced. Someone who'd clearly anticipated needing to preserve evidence against attempts at destruction. Sophie. The name came out choked with implications Catherine couldn't avoid recognizing. If Richard knows to target your apartment, if he's filed protective orders that characterize you as dangerous, social services will be notified. They'll question whether Sophie's safe in your custody, whether your involvement in this situation constitutes neglect or endangerment of minor child. Daniel's hands stopped moving on keyboard, the recognition hitting him with visible force. His daughter was leverage Richard could exploit, innocent person who could be turned into hostage through legal mechanisms designed to protect children from genuinely dangerous parents. The calculation was ruthless and effective, using Daniel's primary vulnerability against him in a way that didn't require physical threat. I need to call my sister. Daniel pulled out phone with hands that weren't quite steady. Get Sophie to Maryland where Richard can't reach her easily. Tell my sister enough truth that she understands why I'm asking, but not so much that she becomes target too. His voice cracked slightly. I knew this would be dangerous for me, but I thought I'd kept Sophie insulated enough that she wouldn't become collateral damage. The moment crystallized everything wrong with how power operated in their society, the way wealthy criminals could weaponize protective systems against people who threatened them, turning child welfare laws and protective orders and legal process itself into ammunition against those who demanded accountability. Catherine felt rage mixing with fear in her chest, combustible combination that made her want to burn everything down rather than navigate the maze of regulations Richard had constructed around them. They worked in synchronized urgency. Daniel coordinating his daughter's emergency evacuation while Catherine consolidated evidence and contacted Rebecca about the protective order. The attorney's response was grimly pragmatic recognition that Richard was deploying scorched earth defense that would make everyone involved radioactive before evidence could be properly examined. By the time they left library, Sophie was on bus to Maryland with Daniel's sister. Their backup evidence was distributed beyond Richard's reach, and they were committed to voluntarily entering federal custody rather than forcing confrontation with local law enforcement that might not be neutral. The drive downtown felt like countdown to imprisonment, Catherine and Daniel processing their situation with the bleak humor of people who'd run out of better options. Traffic was terrible in ways that felt almost welcome delay before surrendering freedom. Neither was certain they'd regain on terms they could accept. Your sister will take care of Sophie. Catherine needed reassurance that Daniel's sacrifice wasn't destroying the family he'd worked so hard to protect after Jennifer's death. Angela raised 3 kids of her own, lived through her husband's deployment to Afghanistan. Daniel spoke with confidence that suggested deep trust despite obvious strain. She'll keep Sophie safe and normal until this resolves, won't let her see news coverage or understand how bad things have gotten. My daughter will be scared and confused, but she'll be okay. That's what matters more than my freedom or reputation or anything else Richard can take from me. The selflessness was absolute and devastating. Father prioritizing child's well-being over his own survival, with the unquestioning commitment that defined good parenting. Catherine thought about her own life, the choices she'd made that prioritized career over relationships, the hypothetical children she'd never had because building company felt more important than building family. Richard had stolen professional identity she'd centered her existence around, but Daniel was risking actual human connection that transcended corporate achievement. The comparison made her previous priorities feel hollow in ways she'd have to process later, if later ever arrived. They reached FBI field office with 40 minutes to spare, entering through southeast entrance as directed. Agent Martinez met them personally, expression suggesting she was genuinely concerned about their safety rather than treating them as suspects who deserved whatever Richard was orchestrating. The protective custody was processed with bureaucratic efficiency. Catherine and Daniel separated into different interview rooms, their devices confiscated, and evidence logged with chain of custody protocols that would make it admissible in eventual trial. The room they gave Catherine was designed to be non-threatening conference space rather than interrogation cell, but the locked door made clear she wasn't free to leave regardless of how comfortable the furniture was. Hours passed in anxious limbo, Catherine alone with thoughts that spiraled between rage and despair and desperate planning for contingencies she couldn't adequately anticipate. Agent Martinez checked on her periodically, providing updates that were maddeningly vague about what was happening with Richard's legal maneuvering. Evening arrived with unexpected visitor Rebecca Santos, arriving with expression that mixed triumph and ongoing concern in ways that suggested partial victory rather than complete resolution. The protective order was denied. Richard's attorney couldn't provide credible evidence that you or Daniel posed imminent physical threat, and judge was skeptical about weaponizing protective order process for purposes of evidence suppression. Her smile was sharp. Judge actually cited Richard's history of litigation against former employees as patterns suggesting the order was retaliation rather than legitimate safety concern. The relief was profound but incomplete recognition that they'd survived one attack but remained vulnerable to next escalation. Did they execute search warrant on Daniel's apartment anyway? They tried. Rebecca's satisfaction was evident, but FBI had already secured the location as material witnesses' residence relevant to ongoing federal investigation. Local law enforcement was notified that any search would constitute interference with federal case. She pulled up her phone, showed Catherine photograph of police standing outside Daniel's building, clearly frustrated that their warrant had been preempted. Richard's wasting his tactical advantages faster than he's creating them, which suggests he's more worried about your evidence than his lawyers want to admit. Catherine processed this information, recognizing it represented momentum shift even if overall position remained precarious. When can I leave custody? Tomorrow morning after protective order hearing, where you can formally respond to Richard's allegations. Martinez wants you available for additional questioning tonight about some financial records that need explanation. Rebecca's expression turned more serious. But there's development you need to know about. 2 more former employees contacted my office this afternoon, both with stories about being systematically destroyed by Richard after discovering irregularities. Both with documentation they were too afraid to release while he remained powerful. The dam is breaking, Catherine. People are coming forward now that they see someone else fighting. The revelation transformed Catherine's isolation into beginning of movement recognition that she wasn't alone in having been targeted by Richard's machine. Other victims existed, other witnesses, whose testimony would corroborate patterns Michael had documented. The prospect of collective action, rather than individual vendetta, made the fight feel simultaneously more manageable and more significant. The evening questioning stretched past midnight. Agent Martinez walking Catherine through financial records with forensic accountant who'd spent the day tracing Richard's shell companies and money flows. The investigation was comprehensive and thorough in ways that made Catherine cautiously optimistic that truth would eventually matter more than Richard's legal warfare. By the time they released her to hotel room, FBI had secured for her safety, exhaustion had progressed past tired into some other state where body kept functioning despite mind's conviction that collapse was overdue. Sleep came in fragments interrupted by nightmares and anxiety, and the particular hypervigilance that came from knowing powerful person wanted you destroyed badly enough to deploy every weapon at his disposal. Morning arrived too soon, bringing with it protective order, hearing that would determine whether Richard could successfully paint Catherine as threat requiring legal suppression. The courtroom was smaller than Catherine expected, administrative hearing rather than dramatic criminal trial, but the stakes felt existential anyway. Richard sat with his attorneys perfectly composed in expensive suit that projected authority and wounded innocence simultaneously. He didn't look at Catherine directly, maintaining posture of someone too dignified to engage with baseless accusations from unstable former employee who'd betrayed his trust. The hearing proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. Richard's attorney arguing that Catherine had made threats and exhibited pattern of behavior, suggesting capacity for violence, that protective order was necessary preventive measure rather than attempt at silencing legitimate whistleblower. The arguments were technically sophisticated and factually dishonest, carefully constructed to sound reasonable while misrepresenting every substantive fact. Rebecca dismantled the claims methodically, walking through timeline that showed Catherine had never made threats, that her supposed instability was successful, professional, achieving recognition in competitive industry, that protective order was transparently retaliatory response to criminal allegations supported by comprehensive documentation. The judge listened with expression, suggesting he'd seen this pattern before and remained unimpressed by wealthy defendant attempting to weaponize protective order process. The ruling came swiftly, denial of protective order, with specific finding that petition appeared to be harassment rather than legitimate safety concern. Richard's expression flickered with anger before control reasserted itself, recognition that this legal gambit had failed to suppress evidence or intimidate Catherine into silence. Catherine felt vindication mixing with awareness that Richard wouldn't stop, that each defeated tactic would be replaced with new escalation until someone prevailed completely. Outside courthouse, media had assembled for statements neither Catherine nor Richard wanted to provide, but couldn't avoid without ceding narrative control. Rebecca managed Catherine's brief response, carefully scripted acknowledgement that protective order had been denied, confidence that federal investigation would reveal truth, refusal to engage with specific allegations while criminal case remained pending. Richard's statement was longer and more aggressive, characterizing Catherine as embittered former employee whose false allegations were damaging company and employees who depended on its continued success. The dueling press conferences would provide content for evening news and tomorrow's business coverage, competing narratives that would shape public opinion before evidence could be properly examined. Catherine understood she was losing the immediate media battle, even as she potentially won the longer legal war. Richard's resources and experience with reputation management overwhelming her authentic outrage and documented truth. Daniel was waiting when Catherine emerged from media scrum, having been released from FBI custody that morning, with similar restrictions about remaining available for ongoing investigation. His expression suggested he'd spent the night processing similar anxieties about Sophie's safety and the wisdom of choices that had led them both into Richard's crosshairs. They didn't speak immediately, just stood together in cold November morning that promised winter arriving earlier than anyone wanted. Sophie made it safely to Maryland. Daniel broke the silence with information that mattered most. My sister says she's confused and sad, but handling it as well as 9-year-old can when her dad suddenly sends her across the country without explanation. Angela's telling her it's temporary work situation that requires me to focus without distraction. Not entirely a lie. Catherine felt the weight of Daniel's sacrifice in ways that transcended her own struggles. Recognition that he was paying price for fighting battles that weren't originally his. You could still walk away. Take Sophie somewhere Richard can't reach you. Let federal investigation proceed without making yourself continued target. Could. Daniel's voice carried finality that suggested he'd considered and rejected that option repeatedly. But won't. Because Richard killed my wife and dozens of other people, and I spent 5 years being invisible instead of fighting. Because walking away now means everyone who's coming forward to testify gets abandoned to face Richard alone. His jaw tightened. Because sometimes you have to stand for something even when standing means becoming target. That's what I want Sophie to learn, that her father fought for what mattered instead of protecting himself by letting evil people win. The conviction was unshakable and slightly terrifying recognition that Daniel had committed to this course regardless of personal cost. Catherine understood that commitment because she felt mirror version of it, the refusal to accept destruction quietly even when submission might be tactically smarter. They were both trapped by principles that seemed increasingly quaint in a world where power trumped truth with such reliable consistency. The weeks ahead would test whether those principles mattered enough to sustain them through what Richard would deploy next. But standing in that cold morning outside courthouse that had just validated their fight in small but significant way, Catherine felt something that might have been hope beginning to compete with the fear and anger and exhaustion that had dominated since being dragged from her car outside Brennan Technologies. The battle wasn't over. Possibly it was just beginning. But for the first time since this nightmare started, Catherine recognized she might actually survive it with enough pieces intact to rebuild something worth having. The federal investigation proceeded with bureaucratic patience that felt agonizing to people whose lives hung in balance, while prosecutors methodically built comprehensive case. Catherine existed in strange limbo between celebrity and pariah, recognized everywhere she went, but uncertain whether recognition came from people who believed she was victim or criminal. The uncertainty was its own form of torture, worse in some ways than being definitively condemned, because it meant constantly managing other people's judgment while waiting for official vindication that might never arrive. Rebecca Santos coordinated their defense with the systematic thoroughness of someone who'd learned that federal cases were won through documentation rather than dramatic courtroom moments. The attorney assembled a timeline that covered years of Richard's criminal activity, organized witness testimony from former employees who'd finally found courage to speak, prepared financial analysis that traced every dollar through shell companies back to accounts Richard controlled. The work was tedious and comprehensive, and occasionally produced breakthroughs that justified the hundreds of hours invested in minutia. 3 weeks after the protective order hearing breakthrough arrived in form of Patricia Voss requesting meeting through channels that suggested she was preparing to flip on Richard. The former Air Force colonel who'd stood beside him during Catherine's humiliation apparently possessed limits to her loyalty when confronted with evidence of systematic criminality that went beyond aggressive business tactics into actual fraud and murder. Agent Martinez arranged the meeting with prosecutorial skepticism about late conversions from people who'd been complicit for years, but willingness to accept cooperation regardless of motivation. Patricia arrived at FBI office looking diminished compared to the authoritative presence she'd projected during board meetings, exhaustion and stress having stripped away the military bearing that had defined her public persona. She carried documents that suggested she'd been preparing for this conversation longer than her sudden cooperation implied, evidence she'd apparently been collecting as insurance against possibility that Richard's machine would eventually target her the way it had targeted everyone else who'd gotten too close to his operations. I knew about the warehouse fire. Patricia's confession began with the crime that had destroyed Daniel's life and ended Jennifer's. Richard told me it was unfortunate accident caused by contractor negligence, that the cover-up was necessary to prevent frivolous lawsuits that would bankrupt the company. I believed him, or I told myself I believed him, because examining it too closely would have required admitting I'd helped destroy innocent man's career to protect guilty one. Her voice was flat professional distance that military training provided against emotions that would otherwise be overwhelming. But when Michael died, when I saw how quickly Richard moved to frame Catherine, using exactly the same playbook, I started reviewing everything with assumption that Richard had been lying about more than I'd admitted to myself. The documents Patricia provided were devastating in their implications. Board meeting minutes that had supposedly been destroyed, but she'd preserved financial records, showing she'd been tracking Richard's shell companies independently, email exchanges where other board members expressed concerns about his activities before being systematically marginalized or removed. Most critically, she provided testimony about conversations with Richard where he'd explicitly discussed eliminating problems through methods that went beyond legal business tactics. Agent Martinez accepted the cooperation with professional gratitude that didn't quite hide skepticism about Patricia's timing and motivations. But prosecutors understood that cases against powerful defendants required inside witnesses regardless of whether those witnesses deserved forgiveness for their complicity. Catherine watched the interview through one-way glass, feeling complicated emotions about woman who'd stood silent during her destruction, now attempting partial redemption through cooperation that came only after recognizing Richard would eventually target her too. People don't betray principles they hold. Daniel stood beside Catherine, observing Patricia's testimony with expression that suggested he was processing his own complicated feelings about late converts to the side of truth. They abandon principles they claim to hold when cost of maintaining them exceeds benefit. Patricia's not having moral awakening. She's calculating that cooperating with prosecutors offers better outcome than remaining loyal to Richard while his machine collapses around him. The cynicism was earned, but Catherine recognized that motivation mattered less than information. Patricia provided testimony that corroborated Michael's documentation and filled gaps in timeline that had existed because dead CFO couldn't testify to conversations he'd witnessed. The case against Richard was becoming bulletproof in ways that made even Rebecca Santos cautiously optimistic that justice might actually prevail, despite resources Richard could deploy in his defense. More witnesses followed Patricia's lead pattern of cooperation, accelerating, as Richard's former allies recognized the ship was sinking and calculated that cooperation offered better survival odds than loyalty to someone who'd use them as disposable tools. David Martinez, the venture capitalist who'd signed off on Catherine's removal, provided testimony about Richard's explicit discussions of framing her for embezzlement during acquisition negotiations. Junior employees came forward with stories of being pressured to falsify records and threatened when they'd expressed concerns. Former regulators admitted they'd been bribed to overlook violations. The systematic corruption extended further than even Michael's comprehensive documentation had captured, touching dozens of people who'd been compromised or destroyed over decades of Richard's operation. The media coverage shifted as witness testimony accumulated initial narrative of CEO embezzlement, transforming into larger story about corporate corruption and the mechanisms powerful people use to evade accountability. Catherine found herself uncomfortably centered in story that was really about systemic problems rather than individual heroism, journalists casting her as whistleblower rather than victim in framing that felt simultaneously validating and incomplete. The nuance of her situation, that she'd been genuine victim before becoming reluctant fighter, got lost in narrative demands for clear heroes and villains. Daniel remained mostly invisible in media coverage, despite being equally central to case his role downplayed because janitor turned investigator didn't fit neat storytelling conventions reporters preferred. The invisibility frustrated Catherine, but Daniel seemed almost relieved by it, recognition that public attention was burden he'd already experienced after Jennifer's death and had no desire to repeat. His focus remained on Sophie daily calls to Maryland, where his sister reported that 9-year-old was adjusting to unexpected extended stay with combination of resilience and confusion about why Dad couldn't just come get her already. 2 months after Catherine's initial ouster, federal grand jury returned indictments against Richard Holloway on 17 counts, including fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder regarding Michael Garrett's death. The charges were comprehensive and carried potential sentences that would effectively mean life imprisonment for someone Richard's age, stakes that transformed his defense from aggressive to desperate. His attorneys immediately began negotiating plea deals that would minimize exposure, recognition that fighting charges was increasingly hopeless as witness cooperation accumulated. Catherine received the news of indictments while sitting in Daniel's apartment, the space that had become unofficial headquarters for their legal defense, despite its modest size and residential nature. The relief was profound, but complicated by recognition that indictments weren't convictions, that Richard would fight with every resource at his disposal, that justice delayed might ultimately be justice denied through procedural maneuvering and appeal strategies that could stretch on for years. She'd won significant battle, but the war remained uncertain. They were offering him a deal. Rebecca called that evening with update from prosecutors. 15 years in federal prison, full restitution testimony against board members who were complicit in various crimes. In exchange, they dropped the murder conspiracy charges and agreed not to pursue death penalty in warehouse fire deaths if additional evidence surfaces supporting murder charges rather than negligent homicide. The offer made Catherine's stomach turn with recognition that justice was negotiable commodity rather than absolute principle, that prosecutors would accept partial accountability rather than risk trial that might result in acquittal if juries were swayed by expensive defense attorneys. But Rebecca walked her through the pragmatic calculus, explained how accepting plea deal guaranteed Richard would spend remainder of his functional life in prison rather than gambling on trial where anything could happen. Daniel's reaction was less measured, visible anger at suggestion that Richard might avoid full consequences for murdering Jennifer and 22 others by pleading guilty to financial crimes and accepting prison term that was substantial but fell short of execution or life without parole. His hands clenched into fists when Catherine relayed the plea, offer recognition that justice system he'd been taught to believe in was preparing to let his wife's killer negotiate away accountability for her death. They want us to accept this. His voice was tight with barely controlled rage. Want us to be satisfied that rich white man will spend comfortable years in federal prison rather than facing death penalty for mass murder. Want us to call it victory because at least he's not walking away completely free like so many powerful criminals do. Catherine understood the fury, but also recognized the alternative, that refusing plea deal meant gambling on trial where Richard's attorneys would deploy every advantage money could buy, where he might be acquitted on technical grounds or have convictions overturned on appeal, where they might invest years in legal battle only to watch him walk free because prosecutors couldn't quite meet their burden of proof. The plea deal was compromise with reality, rather than idealism acceptance that imperfect justice was better than no justice at all. Before they could decide whether to support the plea deal, Richard made the decision for them by rejecting prosecutors' offer and insisting on trial that would fully vindicate his reputation or result in complete conviction. The choice was tactically insane unless he knew something about his defense that prosecutors didn't access to information or witnesses or strategies that would make trial less suicidal gambit than it appeared. Catherine felt dread settling in her chest. Recognition that Richard's confidence suggested the fight wasn't over, despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The trial began on a cold March morning, 6 months after Catherine had been dragged from her car outside Brennan Technologies' lifetime compressed into half-year of legal maneuvering and witness preparation and the systematic reconstruction of lives that had been thoroughly destroyed. Federal courthouse in downtown Chicago drew media attention that transformed routine criminal proceeding into public spectacle cameras and reporters, creating circus atmosphere that felt simultaneously validating and horrifying. Richard arrived in motorcade befitting his wealthy defendant status, surrounded by lawyers and public relations handlers who managed his image with precision that suggested millions spent on reputation defense. He'd lost weight during the months since indictment, stress manifesting physically in ways expensive suits couldn't completely hide, but his expression projected confidence that bordered on arrogance. Catherine watched him enter courthouse and felt visceral hatred that surprised her with its intensity. Recognition that this man had systematically destroyed her professional identity while murdering people who trusted him, all in service of enriching himself and maintaining power he'd accumulated through decades of crime. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically over 3 weeks. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen walking jury through financial records and witness testimony, and the overwhelming documentation Michael Garrett had collected. Catherine testified for 2 days, walking through her relationship with Richard and the systematic manipulation he'd deployed, maintaining composure despite defense attorneys' attempts to paint her as incompetent executive whose failures necessitated her removal. The experience was brutalizing and cathartic, simultaneously public accounting of trauma, while being forced to defend competence and character against attacks designed to discredit rather than illuminate truth. Daniel's testimony was more dramatic, his description of Jennifer's death and subsequent cover-up rendering several jurors visibly emotional despite professional distance they were supposed to maintain. Defense attorneys tried to characterize him as bitter ex-employee with grudge that colored his interpretation of ambiguous evidence, but Daniel's quiet dignity and comprehensive knowledge of systems he'd designed made dismissal difficult. He wasn't an unreliable narrator. Overcome by grief, he was credible witness with direct evidence of crimes that defense couldn't effectively refute. Patricia Voss's testimony proved most devastating to Richard's defense insider witness, confirming that board discussions had included explicit planning of Catherine's destruction and cover-up of previous crimes. Defense attorneys attacked her credibility, viciously suggesting her cooperation was an attempt to avoid prosecution for her own complicity, but prosecutors had granted immunity in exchange for testimony, and juries seemed to accept that reformed accomplice was a credible source regarding crimes she'd participated in before developing conscience. The defense case attempted to construct an alternative narrative where Richard was an aggressive businessman whose tactics sometimes crossed ethical lines but never reached criminal conduct, where Catherine and Daniel were conspiracy theorists who'd fabricated evidence to support vendetta against someone who'd legitimately removed incompetent CEO. The arguments were technically sophisticated but factually unsupported, requiring jury to believe that dozens of witnesses and thousands of pages of documentation were all part of elaborate frame-up rather than accurate representation of systematic criminality. Richard took stand in his own defense, despite attorneys' obvious reluctance, apparently convinced that his personal charm and authority would sway jury where evidence had failed. The testimony was masterclass in confident lying, Richard projecting wounded dignity while explaining away each crime as misunderstanding or legal business tactic that prosecutors had criminalized through overzealous interpretation. He characterized Catherine as promising executive who'd broken under pressure of CEO role, Daniel as tragic figure who'd never recovered from his wife's accidental death, Michael as friend who'd unfortunately developed paranoid delusions before natural death from heart attack. The performance was compelling enough that Catherine felt momentary panic that jury might be swayed, that Richard's decades of manipulating people would prove effective even in courtroom, where evidence should matter more than personality. But cross-examination revealed cracks in his facade, prosecutor Sarah Chen methodically walking him through contradictions between his testimony and documented facts, forcing him to either admit perjury or maintain increasingly implausible claims that strained credibility past breaking point. The moment Richard's defense collapsed came during discussion of warehouse fire, Chen confronting him with email he'd sent to maintenance contractor, explicitly instructing them to disable fire suppression system and chain emergency exits to prevent inventory theft. Richard insisted the email was fabricated despite digital forensics, confirming its authenticity, suggested that even if email was real, it didn't prove he understood the safety implications, claimed he'd relied on contractors to maintain safe conditions regardless of his instructions. The explanations grew more desperate and less coherent as Chen pressed him, Richard finally losing composure and snapping at prosecutor in outburst that revealed anger beneath polished exterior. Deliberations lasted 3 days, jury requesting clarification on several charges and reviewing specific exhibits in detail that suggested they were taking their responsibility seriously rather than rushing to judgment. Catherine spent those days in agony that transcended the previous months of uncertainty, recognition that years of fighting would ultimately be validated or rendered meaningless by 12 strangers' assessment of evidence they'd spent weeks absorbing. Daniel maintained stoic patience that came from years of managing expectations downward, protecting himself against disappointment through refusing to hope too enthusiastically. The verdict came back on Friday afternoon, jury filing in with expressions that gave away nothing about their conclusions. Catherine gripped Daniel's hand hard enough to hurt as foreman stood to deliver verdicts on 17 counts, systematic recitation that felt like it took hours despite lasting less than 5 minutes. Guilty on fraud charges, guilty on embezzlement, guilty on money laundering, guilty on obstruction of justice, guilty on conspiracy to commit murder. guilty on all counts except one technical charge where jury found prosecutors hadn't quite met burden of proof. Richard's expression cycled through disbelief and rage before settling into blank shock recognition that his confidence had been delusion, that money and connections in lifetime of evading accountability had finally failed when confronted with evidence too comprehensive to dismiss. Catherine felt something release in her chest, validation she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath for confirmation that truth could occasionally prevail when supported by enough documentation and witness courage. Daniel's hand tightened around hers, tears streaming down his face despite obvious effort to maintain composure, grief and relief combining into catharsis that years of suppressed emotion finally permitted. Sentencing came 6 weeks later, Judge Patricia Morrison imposing consecutive sentences on multiple counts that totaled 48 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Richard would die behind bars, his empire dismantled, his reputation destroyed, his freedom permanently revoked as consequence of crimes he'd committed with impunity for decades. The sentence was justice in its most literal form, accountability enforced through state power, after every other mechanism of oversight had failed to constrain him. Outside courthouse after sentencing, Catherine stood with Daniel facing assembled media that wanted reaction to verdict and sentence that had just been imposed. Rebecca had prepared statement, but Catherine found herself departing from script, speaking from exhaustion and relief and rage that had accumulated over 8 months of fighting. Richard Holloway spent decades building empire on crimes he thought money and power would let him escape accountability for. She spoke clearly despite emotion threatening to overwhelm her. He murdered my CFO to prevent exposure. He murdered 23 workers in warehouse fire for insurance money. He destroyed careers and families and lives whenever anyone threatened to expose his operation. Today's verdict doesn't undo that damage, doesn't bring back the dead or restore years of life he stole from people. But it proves that sometimes when enough people find courage to speak truth, despite cost, even powerful criminals can be held accountable. Daniel added his own statement, brief and devastating in its simplicity. Jennifer Crawford died burning to death in warehouse Richard Holloway deliberately made unsafe to save money. Today's sentence is justice for her and 22 others who died with her. It's justice for Michael Garrett, who was murdered for collecting evidence. It's justice for everyone Richard destroyed over decades of criminal operation. He paused, composing himself. It won't bring my wife back, but it means her death mattered, that the people responsible were finally held accountable. Sometimes that has to be enough. The media coverage of verdict and sentencing dominated business news for weeks, broader implications about corporate accountability and the mechanisms that allowed powerful people to evade consequences until they finally encountered someone willing to fight back regardless of cost. Catherine became a reluctant symbol of whistleblower courage, despite her protests that she'd been victim before becoming fighter, that her actions were survival rather than heroism. The attention was uncomfortable, but served purpose in encouraging other witnesses to come forward. In other cases, people who'd been silenced by powerful interests, recognizing that sometimes resistance succeeded. Brennan Technologies faced its own reckoning as investigation expanded to examine board members who'd been complicit in Richard's crimes. Several directors were indicted on lesser charges, others resigned in disgraced company, itself forced into restructuring that would determine whether it could survive the systematic corruption that had infected its leadership. Shareholders filed derivative lawsuits seeking recovery of money stolen through Richard's schemes. Employees sued for hostile work environment and wrongful termination. Customers questioned whether they could trust company that had been criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate business. Catherine was approached about returning as CEO. Board members who remained after purge of Richard's allies, recognizing that her technical competence and proven integrity were exactly what company needed to rebuild trust. The offer was generous financially and came with apologies for how she'd been treated, acknowledgement that she'd been right while they'd been complicit in or blind to criminality happening under their oversight. But Catherine recognized that she could never return to Brennan Technologies, that too much damage had been done to relationships and her own psychology for her to effectively lead organization where she'd been so thoroughly betrayed. Instead, she negotiated exit that provided financial security while allowing her to move forward rather than attempting to reconstruct past that had been irreparably corrupted. The settlement included a return of her frozen assets payment for shares that would be repurchased by company agreement that she'd receive proper credit for work she'd done during her tenure rather than having accomplishments attributed to Richard's leadership. More importantly, it included establishment of foundation in Jennifer Crawford's name that would provide support for families affected by corporate crimes, ensuring that some good emerged from tragedy that had catalyzed everything that followed. Daniel declined offers to return to security infrastructure role at Brennan Technologies or other companies that recognized his expertise, recognition that he'd spent 5 years learning to value life outside corporate hierarchies and had no desire to return to systems that measured worth through professional achievement rather than human character. Instead, he accepted position teaching cybersecurity at a community college work that paid modestly but allowed him to share knowledge while maintaining schedule that prioritized being present for Sophie rather than optimizing career advancement. Sophie returned from Maryland 2 weeks after sentencing 9-year-old who'd spent 4 months with her aunt while her father fought battles she couldn't understand in service of principles that mattered more than comfort or safety. She was older than when she'd left in ways that transcended months past. Childhood innocence, weathered by recognition that the world contained dangers that couldn't always be prevented through parental protection. But she was also resilient in ways that suggested children could survive disruption and maintain fundamental trust if adults around them were honest about what was happening and why. Catherine was present when Daniel picked Sophie up from airport, watching reunion between father and daughter, with complicated emotions about the family bonds she'd never prioritized strongly enough to build for herself. Sophie launched into Daniel's arms with the kind of absolute trust that proved whatever trauma she'd experienced during separation hadn't fundamentally damaged their relationship. Recognition that he'd fought for things that mattered, even when fighting meant temporary disruption of their life together. Did you win, Daddy? Sophie's question was simple and complete child's need to understand whether sacrifice had been worthwhile. Yes, sweetheart. Daniel held her tight voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. The bad man who hurt a lot of people is going to prison for a very long time. He can't hurt anyone else now. We won. The simplification was necessary for 9-year-old's understanding, but also profoundly true distillation of months of legal battle and systemic investigation into outcome that could be communicated to child in terms that made sense to her worldview. Good people had fought bad person, and justice had prevailed narrative that was simultaneously incomplete and accurate representation of what had transpired. Catherine spent the months after trial rebuilding her life in ways that didn't center around professional achievement, rediscovering relationships she'd let atrophy during years of prioritizing career over human connection. Her college roommate Madison became regular presence friend who'd maintained loyalty through crisis and now provided support during reconstruction. Former colleagues who'd believed in her reached out once verdict confirmed her innocence, rebuilding professional network that would eventually support whatever career she chose to pursue next. But the urgency to immediately launch into new professional endeavor was absent, replaced by recognition that she needed time to process trauma and determine what actually mattered to her rather than what societal expectations suggested should matter. The relationship with Daniel evolved into something neither quite knew how to categorize, partnership forged through shared crisis that didn't map cleanly onto romantic or platonic categories, but existed in ambiguous space between them. They spent time together, frequently processing the experience they'd shared, while building connection based on genuine understanding rather than strategic alliance. The potential for romance existed, but remained unacted upon, both recognizing they needed healing before introducing additional emotional complexity into lives that had been thoroughly disrupted. 1 year after the verdict, Catherine attended ceremony dedicating Jennifer Crawford Memorial Foundation, nonprofit organization that would provide legal support and financial assistance to families affected by corporate crimes. The foundation was funded through Catherine's settlement with Brennan Technologies and donations from others who'd been inspired by the case to support victims of white-collar crime. Daniel spoke at dedication about Jennifer's life and the senselessness of her death, transforming his grief into mission that would help prevent others from experiencing similar loss. Sophie participated in ceremony by releasing balloons with her mother's name on them, 9-year-old simple ritual of remembrance that carried more emotional weight than any elaborate memorial could have achieved. Catherine watched the balloons rise into Chicago sky and felt something that might have been peace beginning to compete with the anger and grief that had dominated the previous year. Justice had been achieved not perfectly, but substantially, and from that justice came possibility of rebuilding lives that had been thoroughly destroyed by Richard's crimes. The warehouse fire victims' families received restitution from assets seized during Richard's prosecution, money that couldn't replace lost loved ones, but provided some measure of acknowledgement that their deaths hadn't been forgotten. Criminal charges were filed posthumously against contractors and inspectors who'd been complicit in creating unsafe conditions, symbolic accountability, even though primary perpetrator was already imprisoned. The incident was re-examined in workplace safety literature as case study of how profit prioritization and regulatory capture could lead to preventable tragedy, ensuring that Jennifer and her coworkers' deaths contributed to improved protections for future workers. Catherine eventually returned to professional life through founding her own cybersecurity consulting firm, Small Operation, that prioritized ethical practices in employee well-being over growth maximization. The company would never achieve the scale of Brennan Technologies, but that was intentional recognition that size often came at cost of maintaining principles that mattered more than market dominance. Former colleagues who'd remained loyal joined her building organization based on trust rather than hierarchical authority, demonstrating that corporate culture didn't have to be toxic to be successful. Daniel remained teaching at community college, finding satisfaction in work that measured success through students' growth rather than financial metrics. Sophie thrived in stability that came from having a father who was consistently present rather than consumed by professional obligations, developing into a young woman who'd inherited his integrity and Jennifer's warmth. The simple life Daniel had chosen after years of corporate hierarchy was sufficient in ways that his previous success had never been fulfillment, that came from alignment between values and behavior rather than external validation. 5 years after Richard's conviction, Catherine and Daniel stood together at Jennifer's grave on anniversary of the warehouse fire, annual ritual of remembrance they'd maintained since the trial concluded. Sophie placed flowers on her mother's headstone, teenager now, who barely remembered the woman whose death had catalyzed everything but honored her memory through living according to principles her father had fought to defend. The visits were bittersweet, acknowledging loss that couldn't be repaired while recognizing that something meaningful had been built from tragedy. They saved other people. Sophie spoke with the particular wisdom of a young person who'd grown up understanding that life contained injustice, but also possibility of fighting against it. Mom's death wasn't meaningless because it led to foundation that helps families like ours. Dad didn't let the bad man win. Catherine helped him fight. That matters, right? That their deaths led to something good, even though it was terrible, it happened at all. The question demanded honest answer rather than comfortable platitude. Teenagers need to understand whether the world made sense, even when terrible things happen to good people. Catherine looked at Daniel, seeing shared recognition that they owed Sophie truth rather than easy reassurance. Yes, Daniel spoke with conviction earned through years of living with loss. Mom's death matters because we refuse to accept that powerful people could kill with impunity. The fight was hard and the cost was high, but Richard is in prison, and the foundation helps families affected by crimes like those he committed. He knelt beside Sophie, meeting her eyes directly. Would I trade all of it to have your mom back without hesitation? But I can't make that trade, so instead I try to ensure her death contributed to preventing others from experiencing the same loss. That's not the same as justice, but it's the best I can offer her memory. Sophie nodded, accepting answer that acknowledged complexity rather than pretending loss could be redeemed through subsequent good works. The three of them stood in cemetery as Chicago afternoon light slanted through trees, survivors of catastrophe that had demanded everything they had while teaching them what actually mattered beneath the noise of professional achievement and societal status. The fight had been worth it, not because the outcome was perfect or the cost was acceptable, but because refusing to fight would have meant accepting that people like Richard could destroy lives without consequence. That truth was negotiable commodity rather than foundation for functioning society. That power would always triumph over justice, regardless of how much evidence documented the crimes. They'd proven that sometimes when enough people found courage to speak truth despite personal cost, even the powerful could be held accountable. Sometimes that had to be enough. Not everything you wanted, not complete restoration of what had been stolen, but enough to mean the fight mattered. enough to suggest the world could occasionally bend toward justice when pushed by people who refused to accept that betrayal and corruption and murder were simply the cost of doing business. Enough to build on foundation for lives reconstructed according to principles that had survived testing through crisis. Catherine looked at Daniel and Sophie standing beside Jennifer's grave, unlikely family she'd been adopted into through circumstance and choice, survivors of catastrophe who'd refused to let trauma define them completely. The professional identity she'd built before Richard destroyed it was gone irretrievably, but something better had emerged from the wreckage, understanding that worth wasn't measured through achievement and power, but through integrity and connection and willingness to fight for things that mattered, despite cost. The sun was setting over Chicago as they walked back to Daniel's car, the city indifferent to their small drama, while containing it nonetheless millions of stories unfolding simultaneously in spaces where justice and betrayal competed for dominance. They'd won their battle, but the war continued to other Richard Holloways operating in other companies, while people decided whether to fight or accept corruption as an inevitable feature of systems they couldn't change. But they'd proven change was possible when courage and evidence combined sufficiently, when people refused to accept destruction quietly even when resistance seemed futile. The proof mattered beyond their individual story template that other victims could follow when confronting powerful interests that seemed untouchable. Sometimes one victory was enough to inspire others to fight their own battles, ripple effects that extended far beyond original crisis. The Jennifer Crawford Memorial Foundation would continue its work supporting families devastated by corporate crime. Daniel would teach students about systems security and the importance of building ethical frameworks into technical work. Catherine would run her consulting firm according to principles she'd fought to defend. Sophie would grow up understanding that standing for what's right sometimes costs everything, but refusing to stand costs more. The future was uncertain but no longer felt terrifying possibility. Rather than threat, rebuilt lives that honored those who'd been lost while refusing to let their deaths be meaningless. Truth had prevailed, not perfectly, but substantially proof that sometimes the world worked the way it was supposed to when enough people demanded it. That would have to be sufficient. Not everything, but enough. More than they'd had when this started, less than they'd lost along the way, but enough to build on, enough to matter.